My name is Thomas Brennan, and I am 68 years old. The events I am about to tell you happened back in October of 2009, but they haunt me still, as vivid and terrifying as the night they occurred. I have been working as a park ranger in Yosemite National Park for over 30 years, a job that seemed simple enough at first. Keep an eye on the trails, help lost hikers, and make sure nothing went wrong in those endless miles of forest known for its mysterious disappearances. The ranger station sat at the edge of the wilderness, surrounded by towering pines that blocked out the sky, and at night, the darkness beyond those windows was absolute. I have spent countless sleepless nights since then, questioning what I saw, wondering if I should have spoken up sooner. But the weight of silence has become too much to bear. The world needs to know what lurks in the shadows of our wilderness. Before I tell you what happened that October, you need to understand something about Yosemite. Most people who visit see the postcard version. They see Half Dome rising against a perfect blue sky. They see Bridal Veil Fall catching the morning light like a veil of diamonds. They see families posing for photographs at Tunnel View, their smiles wide and carefree. But that is not the Yosemite I know. The Yosemite I know exists in the spaces between the tourist trails, in the vast stretches of backcountry where cell phones become useless plastic rectangles and the nearest human being might be 20 miles away. The Yosemite I know holds darkness in its heart, a darkness that has nothing to do with the absence of light and everything to do with what moves through those ancient forests when no one is watching. I started working as a ranger in the summer of 1979. I was 23 years old, fresh out of college, with a degree in forestry and a head full of romantic notions about life in the great outdoors. The park seemed like paradise to me in those early days. I learned every trail, every hidden waterfall, every secret meadow where the wildflowers bloomed in impossible colors each spring. I thought I knew this land the way I knew my own heartbeat. I was wrong. It took me years to understand that you can spend a lifetime in a place and still not know its true nature, still not comprehend what secrets it guards in its darkest corners. The first time I encountered something that did not fit into my understanding of the natural world was in the autumn of 1985. I was conducting a routine patrol along the Mist Trail when I came across a scene that stopped me dead in my tracks. A campsite had been torn apart with what appeared to be tremendous violence. Tents lay shredded, their fabric hanging in ribbons from the surrounding trees. Backpacks had been ripped open, their contents scattered across a 50-foot radius. Food containers made of supposedly bear-proof material had been crushed as if they were made of paper. But there was no bear sign, no tracks, no scat, no claw marks on the trees. Just destruction, and in the middle of it all, a single hiking boot lying on its side, still laced tight as if its owner had simply evaporated out of it. We searched for 3 days. Dogs, helicopters, volunteer teams combing every inch of the surrounding wilderness. We found nothing. The couple who had been camping there, Jonathan and Margaret Holloway from Sacramento, were never seen again. The official report cited a probable bear encounter followed by disorientation and exposure. It was the first time I witnessed the machinery of bureaucracy smooth over something that defied explanation, and it would not be the last. Over the years, I watched the pattern repeat itself with disturbing regularity. Hikers would vanish from well-marked trails in broad daylight. Experienced mountaineers with decades of backcountry knowledge would walk into the wilderness and simply cease to exist. Children would disappear from campsites while their parents sat mere feet away, and always, the official explanations would come. Animal attacks, accidental falls, voluntary disappearances. The words changed, but the purpose remained the same: to provide comfort, to maintain order, to keep the tourists coming and the money flowing. I understood the reasoning, even as I grew to resent it. What I did not understand, what I could not have understood until that October night in 2009, was just how desperately the truth needed to be hidden. It started with a phone call on the morning of October 14th. I was at the main ranger station, working through a stack of paperwork that seemed to regenerate no matter how many forms I completed. My supervisor, a stern-faced man named Douglas Chen, who had been running the station for 15 years, appeared in my doorway with an expression I had learned to dread. That look meant trouble of the worst kind. He told me that a family had failed to check out of their backcountry campsite in the Rancheria Falls area. They had been due back 2 days ago, and their car was still sitting in the trailhead parking lot. The family consisted of Robert and Cheryl Hamilton, both in their mid-40s, and their 17-year-old daughter, Emily. They were experienced hikers from Colorado, the kind of people who knew what they were doing in the wilderness, the kind of people who did not simply get lost. I assembled a search team, and we headed out within the hour. The trail to Rancheria Falls is not particularly difficult, about 13 miles round trip through some of the most beautiful country Yosemite has to offer. The aspens were turning gold that time of year, and under other circumstances, I might have enjoyed the hike. But there was a heaviness in the air that morning, a thickness that seemed to press against my chest with every step. The other rangers felt it too. I could see it in the way their eyes kept darting to the tree line, in the tightness of their shoulders, in the unusual silence that had fallen over our normally chatty group. We found the Hamiltons' campsite by early afternoon. It was set up precisely according to regulations, the tent properly staked, and the food bear bag hanging from a tree at the appropriate height. Their gear was neatly organized, their hiking boots lined up outside the tent entrance. Everything looked normal, except for one critical detail. The family was gone. Lucas Martinez, one of our younger rangers, made the observation that would haunt me for years to come. He pointed out that the tent zipper was closed from the outside. That simple fact implied something deeply unsettling. The Hamiltons had not left their tent voluntarily. Someone or something had closed them in, and then somehow removed them without opening the zipper again. We expanded our search in widening circles from the campsite. The forest grew denser as we moved away from the trail, the trees pressing closer together until the canopy above became an almost solid roof of green and gold. The sunlight that filtered through took on a strange quality, diffused and weakened as if it were traveling through water rather than air. I found myself struggling to maintain my bearings, even though I had walked these woods hundreds of times before. It was Marcus Webb, a ranger with 15 years of experience, who found the first sign of the Hamiltons. He called out to us in a voice that cracked with something I had never heard from him before. Fear. Raw, primal fear. We gathered around him and stared at what he had discovered. It was a shoe. A woman's hiking shoe, size 7 or 8, still tied in a double knot. The shoe was wedged between 2 rocks at the edge of a small creek, and from the position, it looked as if its owner had been walking upstream when something had plucked her right out of it. But that was not what made Marcus's voice crack. What made his voice crack was what we found next to the shoe: prints. They were pressed into the soft mud along the creek bank, and they were like nothing I had ever seen in 30 years of tracking wildlife through Yosemite. They were vaguely humanoid in shape, with 5 distinct toe impressions, but the proportions were all wrong. The prints were at least 18 inches long and perhaps 8 inches wide. The toe impressions ended in what appeared to be claws, each one leaving a gouge in the mud nearly 2 inches deep. Whatever had made these prints was massive, far larger than any known animal in the park, and it walked on 2 legs. We followed the prints upstream for perhaps a quarter mile before they vanished into a section of granite where they left no trace. The creek wound through a narrow gorge there, the walls rising 30 feet on either side, slick with moss and perpetually shadowed even at midday. Standing at the base of that gorge, I felt a sensation I can only describe as being watched. It was more than a feeling. It was a certainty that pressed against my skull like a physical weight, a knowledge that something was observing us from the darkness above. I ordered the team to fall back. Some of the younger rangers protested, eager to press on and find the missing family, but I pulled rank. There was something wrong with that gorge, something that went beyond the strange prints and the missing hikers. The air itself felt hostile, charged with a malevolence I could taste on the back of my tongue like copper and ozone. We retreated to the Hamilton campsite and radioed for additional support. That night, we made camp at the trailhead. None of us were willing to spend the night in the backcountry, though no one would say why. We built a fire larger than regulations allowed and sat around it in silence, each of us processing what we had seen. The prints, the shoe, the terrible feeling of being observed by something that meant us harm. It was Olivia Chen, Douglas's daughter, and a promising young ranger in her own right, who finally broke the silence. She asked if anyone else had heard the sound. We all turned to look at her, and I felt my stomach drop when I saw the pallor of her face in the firelight. She described a low, rumbling vocalization that had seemed to come from everywhere at once while we were in the gorge. Not quite a growl, not quite a moan, but something in between. Something that had made her bones vibrate and her vision blur at the edges. One by one, the others admitted they had heard it too. All except me. I had been so focused on the physical evidence, so determined to make sense of what we were finding, that I had somehow blocked out the sound, or perhaps whatever was making it had chosen not to let me hear. That thought, when it occurred to me, was more disturbing than anything else that had happened that day. The reinforcements arrived the next morning. Search and rescue teams, tracking dogs, even a helicopter with thermal imaging equipment. Douglas Chen himself came out to supervise, his face set in grim lines that aged him a decade overnight. He took me aside and asked me what I thought we were dealing with. I told him the truth. I told him I did not know. The prints were unlike anything in the biological record. The circumstances of the disappearance defied logical explanation. And the feeling in that gorge, that terrible sense of hostile intelligence, suggested we were dealing with something that operated outside the rules of the natural world as I understood them. Douglas listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he told me something that changed everything. He said this was not the first time. He said there had been incidents going back decades, incidents that were kept out of the official records and known only to a handful of senior rangers. He said there was a reason certain areas of the park were quietly closed to visitors, a reason that had nothing to do with erosion control or wildlife protection. He said there were things living in the deep wilderness of Yosemite that had no names, things that had been here long before the first humans set foot in these mountains, things that were patient and intelligent and utterly without mercy. I wanted to dismiss his words as the ramblings of a man under too much stress, but I could not. Not after what I had seen, not after what I had felt in that shadowed gorge. I asked him what we were supposed to do, and his answer chilled me to the bone. He said we were supposed to find the Hamiltons, and then we were supposed to pray that we did not find what had taken them. The search continued for 3 more days. We covered every inch of terrain within a 10-mile radius of the campsite. We brought in the best trackers the Park Service had to offer. We flew the helicopter in grid patterns until the fuel costs became prohibitive. We found nothing. No bodies, no clothing, no equipment. The Hamiltons had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. On the 4th day, I made a decision that would lead me into the darkest night of my life. I decided to go back to the gorge alone. I know how that sounds. I know it was reckless, possibly suicidal, but I had to understand. 30 years of my life had been devoted to these mountains, and I could not accept that they harbored something so far beyond my comprehension. I needed to see for myself what lurked in those shadows. I needed to know the truth, even if that truth destroyed me. I set out before dawn, telling no one where I was going. The trail was familiar in the early light, the trees casting long shadows that stretched toward me like grasping fingers. I moved quickly and quietly, using skills I had developed over decades of wilderness navigation. By mid-morning, I had reached the creek where we had found the shoe. The prints were gone. Heavy rain 2 nights before had washed away all trace of them, leaving the mud bank smooth and unmarked. But the shoe was still there, wedged between the same 2 rocks, a silent testament to the horror that had unfolded in this place. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands. Size 7.5. Cheryl Hamilton had been a small woman. I followed the creek upstream, moving slowly and stopping frequently to listen. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No bird song, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just the soft gurgle of the water and the sound of my own breathing, loud in my ears. The gorge opened before me like a wound in the earth, its walls rising dark and slick on either side. I hesitated at the entrance, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I did not turn back. I stepped into the shadows. The temperature dropped immediately, a chill that had nothing to do with the lack of sunlight. The walls of the gorge pressed in on me, so narrow in places that I had to turn sideways to squeeze through. The creek became a trickle, and then disappeared entirely, absorbed into the rocky ground. I was climbing now, my hands finding holds in the mossy granite, my feet searching for purchase on the slippery stone. And then I heard it. The sound Olivia had described, a low, resonant vocalization that seemed to come from the rock itself, vibrating through my bones and blurring the edges of my vision. It was not loud, but it was everywhere, filling the gorge with a pressure that made my ears pop and my eyes water. I froze, clinging to the rock face, and waited. The sound faded. Silence returned. But now I could smell something. A thick, organic odor that reminded me of rotting vegetation and wet animal fur. It grew stronger as I climbed, until I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. I knew I should turn back. I knew that every moment I spent in this place was a moment closer to whatever fate had befallen the Hamiltons. But I kept climbing. The gorge opened suddenly into a small clearing, a bowl-shaped depression in the granite perhaps 50 feet across. The walls rose steeply on all sides, and the only entrance was the narrow passage I had just ascended. The floor of the clearing was littered with bones. They were everywhere, scattered across the stone, piled against the walls, some fresh and others so old they had begun to calcite into the rock itself. Animal bones mostly. Deer, bear, mountain lion. But among them, unmistakably, were human remains. I saw skulls, vertebrae, the long bones of arms and legs. I saw scraps of fabric and the glint of metal that might have been belt buckles or zipper pulls. This was a feeding ground, a larder, a place where something brought its prey to consume at leisure. In the center of the clearing, arranged with what appeared to be deliberate care, were 3 bodies. I did not need to see their faces to know who they were. The matching hiking clothes, the family resemblance in their builds, the Colorado Rockies baseball cap lying next to the smallest of the 3. Robert, Cheryl, and Emily Hamilton had been found. They were not intact. I will not describe what had been done to them. Some images should not be put into words, should not be given the permanence of language. Suffice to say that whatever had killed them had taken its time and had not been driven by hunger alone. There was a cruelty to the arrangement of the remains, a deliberate display that suggested intelligence and malice working in terrible concert. This thing, whatever it was, did not simply kill. It enjoyed killing. It took pleasure in the destruction of human life. I do not know how long I stood there, paralyzed by horror. It might have been seconds. It might have been hours. The smell was overwhelming, the sight before me so far beyond anything I had prepared myself for that my mind simply refused to process it. I was dimly aware that I needed to leave, needed to get back to the ranger station and report what I had found, but my legs would not obey. And then I felt it again. That terrible sense of being watched. I turned slowly, my hand moving instinctively to the pistol at my hip. The entrance to the clearing was behind me, the narrow passage descending into shadow. And standing at the threshold, blocking my only exit, was something that should not have existed. It was tall. That was my first impression. Impossibly tall, at least 8 feet, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. It stood hunched, its massive shoulders brushing the walls of the passage on either side. Its skin, what I could see of it in the dim light, was a mottled gray-brown, rough and textured like tree bark. But it was the face that held me frozen in place. It had no eyes. Where eyes should have been, there were only smooth depressions in the flesh, shallow concavities that somehow managed to convey attention and focus despite their emptiness. The mouth was a horizontal slash that ran nearly the full width of the head, filled with teeth that were too numerous and too sharp for any natural creature. And the smell that emanated from it, that rotting vegetable stench I had noticed in the gorge, was so intense now that it seemed to have physical weight. We stared at each other across the clearing. Or rather, I stared while it regarded me with those empty sockets, its head tilting slowly from side to side as if trying to see me from different angles. The low, resonant sound began again, and I realized with horror that it was coming from the creature itself, a vibration that started deep in its chest and radiated outward in waves I could feel against my skin. I drew my pistol. The motion seemed to trigger something in the creature because it shifted forward, its movement fluid despite its massive size. I fired. The report was deafening in the enclosed space, and I saw the bullet strike the creature's shoulder, saw a splash of something dark that might have been blood. It did not slow down. What happened next exists in my memory as a series of disconnected images, fragments of terror that refuse to arrange themselves into a coherent narrative. I remember running, not toward the creature, but up the wall of the clearing, my hands finding holds I did not know existed. I remember the sound of the thing behind me, that awful vocalization rising to a pitch that made my skull feel like it was splitting. I remember the scrape of claws on stone, impossibly close, and the smell of its breath on the back of my neck. I remember pulling myself over the rim of the clearing and tumbling down the other side of the gorge, sliding and falling through a nightmare landscape of moss-covered rock and clutching branches. I remember running through the forest in the gathering dusk, running without direction or purpose, driven only by the need to put distance between myself and that terrible place. And I remember, with a clarity that still wakes me screaming in the night, the moment I realized I was not going to make it. The creature had circled around me. I do not know how. The terrain should have made such a maneuver impossible, but there it was, standing among the trees ahead of me, its eyeless face turned in my direction. I skidded to a halt, my lungs burning and my legs threatening to give out beneath me. The pistol was still in my hand, though I had no memory of holding on to it. I raised it and fired again and again and again, until the slide locked back on an empty magazine. The creature absorbed the bullets without apparent effect. It began to move toward me, its gait unhurried now, almost leisurely. It knew I had nowhere left to run. It was savoring the moment. And then, from somewhere behind me, came the sound of voices, human voices, shouting my name. The creature paused, its head turning toward the sound. For a long moment, it stood motionless, and I could almost believe it was weighing its options, calculating the risks and rewards of continuing its pursuit. Then it was gone. It did not retreat or withdraw. It simply vanished, one moment a solid presence in the fading light, and the next an empty space between the trees. I collapsed to my knees and stayed there, shaking uncontrollably, until Lucas Martinez and Olivia Chen found me. The official story was that I had become disoriented in the backcountry and gotten lost. The discovery of the Hamiltons' remains was attributed to an ongoing search effort, and the condition of the bodies was blamed on scavengers. There was no mention of the bone-filled clearing, no mention of the creature, no mention of the fact that a veteran ranger had emptied his service weapon into something that should not have existed. Douglas Chen visited me in the hospital the next day. He did not ask what had happened. He did not need to. Instead, he told me about the protocols, the procedures that had been developed over decades to manage incidents like this one, the careful compartmentalization of information, the prepared explanations and cover stories, the network of senior rangers who knew the truth and had sworn to protect it. He asked me if I was willing to become part of that network. He asked me if I could carry the weight of that knowledge for the rest of my career. I told him yes. What else could I do? I had seen the alternative. I had seen what happened to people who wandered unprepared into the territory of something that predated human civilization. The public needed to be protected, not from the truth, but from its consequences. If people knew what really lurked in the wild places of our country, if they understood how thin the line was between their comfortable lives and an ancient, hungry darkness, the resulting panic would be catastrophic. So I kept silent. For 15 years I kept silent. I continued my work as a ranger, guiding hikers and maintaining trails and pretending that the worst dangers in Yosemite were bears and weather and the occasional rock slide. I learned to live with the nightmares, with the memories that ambushed me in quiet moments, with the knowledge that somewhere out there in the vast wilderness I had devoted my life to protecting, something terrible was waiting. But I could not forget. And as the years passed, I began to notice things that others might have missed. Patterns in the disappearances, concentrations of unexplained incidents in certain areas, behaviors that suggested not random predation, but something more purposeful, more intelligent. The creature, I came to believe, was not alone, and it was not confined to that single gorge where I had found the Hamiltons. In the autumn of 2007, a geology student named Jennifer Watts disappeared from a research site near Tuolumne Meadows. She had been cataloging rock formations for her doctoral thesis, working alone in an area that had been closed to the public for years. Her campsite was found intact, her notes and equipment undisturbed. The only sign of struggle was a single bloody handprint on a boulder, too smeared to yield useful evidence. 3 months later, a pair of experienced mountaineers vanished during a winter ascent of Mount Lyell. Their climbing ropes were found anchored to the rock face, cut cleanly as if by a blade, with no trace of the men who had been using them. The search was called off after an avalanche made the area too dangerous to explore. In the spring of 2008, a family of 5 from Texas disappeared during a day hike to Mirror Lake. They had been on a marked trail within sight of the valley floor. 100 other hikers had passed through the same area that day, and not one of them reported seeing anything unusual. The family was simply there one moment and gone the next, leaving behind nothing but a child-stuffed rabbit lying in the middle of the path. Each incident followed the same pattern. No bodies recovered, no coherent explanation. Official reports citing accidents, exposure, voluntary disappearance, and always that quick, efficient smoothing over of the details that might have raised uncomfortable questions. I compiled my own records, names, dates, locations, circumstances. I mapped the disappearances and looked for connections. What I found disturbed me deeply. The incidents were not random. They clustered around specific geographic features, areas where the terrain was most rugged and the wilderness most impenetrable. They occurred most frequently during certain times of year, particularly the transitional months of spring and autumn when the park was less crowded and the backcountry was most accessible. And they showed a clear preference for certain types of victims: solo hikers, small groups, families with children. The creatures, whatever they were hunting. And they were hunting strategically. I brought my findings to Douglas Chen in the summer of 2009. He listened without interrupting, his face growing more grave with each detail I presented. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he told me something that made the blood drain from my face. He told me the creatures were getting bolder. He told me the incidents were increasing in frequency and moving closer to populated areas. He told me that just the previous month, a maintenance worker had been attacked within sight of the Ahwahnee Hotel, dragged into the forest so quickly that the guests who witnessed it thought they had seen a bear. He told me he was afraid the protocols were no longer working. He told me he was afraid that soon, very soon, there would be an incident that could not be explained away. And he told me there was a plan, a desperate, dangerous plan to confront the creatures on their own territory and determine once and for all what we were dealing with. He asked me to lead the team. I agreed. How could I not? I had carried the weight of this secret for 15 years. I had watched the disappearances mount and the explanations grow thinner. I had lived with the memory of that eyeless face, those impossible teeth, that terrible sound that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. If there was any chance of stopping it, of protecting the thousands of innocent people who wandered into these woods every year, I had to take it. The team was assembled in secret over the following weeks. 8 rangers, all veterans, all carefully selected for their skills and their discretion. Olivia Chen was among them, as was Lucas Martinez and Marcus Webb, who had found the bloody shoe all those years ago. We were given equipment that was not part of any official inventory. Night vision gear, communication devices with encrypted channels, weapons that would have been wildly inappropriate for any legitimate Park Service operation. And we were given a target, a remote valley in the northern reaches of the park, accessible only by a grueling 2-day hike through some of the most rugged terrain Yosemite had to offer. Satellite imagery had detected unusual thermal signatures in the valley, heat sources that could not be attributed to any known geological or biological phenomena. It was, Douglas believed, a nesting ground, a place where the creatures congregated and bred and raised their young. We set out on October 12, 2009. The weather was perfect, clear skies and mild temperatures, the kind of autumn day that drew photographers and leaf peepers from across the country. We took a route that avoided all marked trails, moving through the backcountry with a speed and precision that spoke to years of experience. By nightfall of the first day, we had covered 15 miles and made camp in a sheltered hollow, well away from any hiking route. That night, as we huddled around a small fire and checked our equipment, I looked at the faces of my team and felt a complex mixture of pride and dread. These were good people, brave people. They had volunteered for this mission knowing that they might not come back. They deserved to know the truth, all of it, before we went any further. So I told them. I told them about the Hamiltons. I told them about the clearing and the bones and the creature that had nearly killed me. I told them about the years of investigation, the patterns I had discovered, the mounting evidence that we were facing something far more dangerous than any of us had imagined. When I finished, no one spoke. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. Then Olivia Chen, whose father had first introduced me to the secret all those years ago, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. She asked what we would do if we found them. I told her I did not know. The plan, such as it was, called for reconnaissance and documentation. We were to observe the creatures, record their behavior, and gather evidence that could be used to develop a more comprehensive response. We were not expected to engage unless absolutely necessary, but we all knew how unlikely that scenario was. These things did not tolerate intrusion into their territory. They did not allow witnesses to escape. Whatever we found in that valley, we would almost certainly have to fight our way out. We broke camp before dawn and continued our trek into the wilderness. The terrain grew more difficult as we climbed, the trees giving way to exposed granite and fields of broken talus. By mid-afternoon of the second day, we had reached the rim of the target valley and were looking down into a landscape that seemed to belong to another world entirely. The valley was perhaps 2 miles long and half a mile wide, its floor carpeted with old-growth forest so dense that the ground beneath the trees was invisible from our vantage point. A stream wound through the center, glinting silver in the afternoon light. The walls rose steeply on all sides, creating a natural amphitheater that would be almost impossible to access except through the narrow gap at the southern end where we were positioned. It was beautiful. Hauntingly, terrifyingly beautiful. We descended in single file, moving slowly and stopping frequently to scan our surroundings. The forest closed around us like a living thing, the canopy so thick that the afternoon sunlight dimmed to a greenish twilight. The air was heavy with moisture and that familiar smell, that rotting vegetation odor I remembered from the gorge. We were in their territory now. I could feel it in my bones. The first sign came an hour into our descent. Lucas Martinez, who was walking point, held up his fist to signal a stop. We gathered around him in silence and stared at what he had found. It was a marker, a pile of stones arranged in a deliberate pattern, topped with what appeared to be an animal skull. The skull had been stripped of flesh and bleached white by the elements, but I could still identify it as belonging to a mountain lion. It was facing outward, its empty eye sockets turned toward the direction from which we had come. A warning, a territorial boundary, a message that we were not welcome here. We pressed on. What choice did we have? We had come too far to turn back now, and the information we sought lay somewhere ahead in the depths of the valley. But I noticed that the team had grown quieter, their movements more cautious. They felt it too, the presence, the watching. As the light began to fade, we made camp in a small clearing beside the stream. I set up a rotating watch schedule and distributed the night vision equipment. The plan was to wait until full dark and then move deeper into the valley, using the cover of night to observe without being observed. It was a good plan, logical, professional. It did not survive first contact. Marcus Webb had the first watch. He was positioned at the edge of the clearing, facing into the forest, his night vision goggles turning the darkness into a sea of ghostly green. The rest of us were trying to get what sleep we could, our bodies exhausted from the long hike, but our minds too wired to fully relax. I was drifting in that twilight state between waking and sleeping when the scream tore through the night. I was on my feet before I knew I had moved, my weapon drawn and my heart hammering against my ribs. The camp was chaos. Flashlight beams swung wildly through the darkness. Voices shouted questions and commands that overlapped into meaningless noise. And from somewhere in the forest, that sound, that terrible resonant vocalization, was building to a pitch that made my teeth ache. Marcus was gone. His night vision goggles lay on the ground where he had been sitting, but there was no sign of the man himself. No blood, no struggle, just an empty space where a moment ago a living human being had been. We formed a defensive circle, backs to the center of the clearing, weapons pointed outward into the impenetrable darkness. The sound surrounded us now, coming from every direction at once. I could feel it in my chest, a vibration that seemed to sync with my heartbeat and slow it to a crawl. My vision blurred at the edges. My thoughts became sluggish and disconnected. And then I saw them. They emerged from the trees on all sides, not walking but flowing, their movements liquid and silent despite their massive size. There were at least a dozen of them, maybe more. Their gray-brown skin seemed to absorb the light from our flashlights, reflecting nothing back. Their eyeless faces turned toward us with that terrible, focused attention. Their mouths opened, revealing row upon row of needle-like teeth, and the sound that emanated from them was like nothing I have ever heard before or since. It was a chorus, a harmony, a song of hunger and anticipation that spoke directly to something ancient and primal in the human brain. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to drop my weapon and run, to flee into the darkness and never look back. I saw members of my team fighting the same battle, their faces contorted with the effort of maintaining their positions. The circle broke. I do not know who moved first. One moment we were standing together. The next we were scattered and running, crashing through the underbrush in blind panic as the creatures pursued. I heard gunfire behind me, short controlled bursts that spoke of training overcoming terror. I heard screams, some cut short and others trailing off into the distance. I heard my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart and nothing else. I ran until I could run no more. I collapsed against a massive fallen tree, my legs burning and my lungs screaming for air. The forest around me was silent now. That terrible chorus faded to nothing. I fumbled for my radio, praying that it had not been lost in the chaos. The static that answered my call was the loneliest sound I have ever heard. I spent the rest of that night hiding in the hollow beneath the fallen tree. I did not sleep. I did not move. I simply lay there in the darkness, listening to the small sounds of the forest and waiting for something to find me. The creatures did not come. Perhaps they had taken enough. Perhaps they were saving me for later. Or perhaps, and this thought chilled me more than any other, they simply did not care. Dawn came slowly, gray light filtering through the canopy in painful increments. I emerged from my hiding place and began to make my way back toward the clearing where we had made camp. The forest looked different in the daylight, less hostile but no less strange. I moved carefully, starting at every sound, my weapon drawn and my finger on the trigger. The clearing was empty. The tents had been torn apart, the equipment scattered. Blood stained the ground in several places, but there were no bodies. There were never any bodies. The creatures, I had come to realize, were thorough. I searched the area for survivors. I found Olivia Chen huddled in a hollow log a quarter-mile from the camp, her eyes wide and blank with shock. Lucas Martinez was discovered clinging to a branch 30 feet up a massive pine tree, unable to explain how he had gotten there or how to get down. We never found Marcus Webb or any of the others. The three of us made the long trek back to civilization in a daze. We did not speak of what had happened. We did not need to. The horror of that night was written on our faces, in our hollow eyes and trembling hands. The debrief that followed was perfunctory. Douglas Chen listened to our accounts and nodded slowly, his face unreadable. More protocols were established. More cover stories were prepared. The disappearance of 5 experienced rangers was attributed to a flash flood in the backcountry, a tragedy that the Park Service mourned publicly while privately noting that the affected area would be closed indefinitely for safety reasons. I retired 2 months later. I could not stay. Every time I looked at the trees, I saw them moving. Every time the wind blew, I heard that terrible chorus. The wilderness I had loved my entire life had become a place of nightmares, a vast and hungry darkness that watched me with eyeless patience. In the years since, I have followed the news from Yosemite with a mixture of dread and resignation. The disappearances continue. The official explanations become ever more elaborate. The machinery of denial grows more sophisticated with each passing season, and somewhere in the deep wilderness, in valleys and gorges that no tourist will ever see, the creatures wait. I do not know what they are. I have spent countless hours researching myths and legends, searching for some parallel to what I experienced. The closest I have found are the old stories of the indigenous peoples who lived in these mountains before the Europeans came. They spoke of beings that existed between the world of men and the world of spirits. Ancient intelligences that had walked the earth when it was young and would continue to walk it long after humanity was gone. They called them by many names, none of which I will repeat here. To name them, the story said, was to draw their attention. I believe now that these beings are not supernatural. They are not ghosts or demons or visitors from another world. They are simply old in a way that defies human understanding. They were here before the redwoods, before the glaciers, before the mountains themselves rose from the earth. They have watched empires rise and fall. They have seen species evolve and go extinct. And they have learned, over vast spans of time, how to hunt the one prey that matters: us. The national parks we treasure are not pristine wilderness preserved for our enjoyment. They are territories, preserves, places where the old ones have been pushed but not defeated, contained but not controlled. Every trail we hike, every campsite we set up, every photograph we take of the breathtaking scenery is a violation of boundaries that we cannot see and will not survive crossing. I tell you this not to frighten you, though fear is an appropriate response. I tell you because the secret has been kept too long, protected by too many, at too great a cost. People have a right to know what waits for them in the wild places. They have a right to make informed choices about where they go and what risks they take. They have a right to understand that the warning signs and the closed areas and the official explanations are not always what they seem. Yosemite National Park receives over 4 million visitors each year. Most of them will have wonderful experiences. They will see the waterfalls and the granite domes and the ancient sequoias. They will take pictures and make memories and return home safely to their ordinary lives. But some of them will not. Some of them will wander off the marked trails. Some of them will venture into areas they should not go. Some of them will make the mistake of thinking that the wilderness is beautiful and benign and waiting to embrace them. Those are the ones who will learn the truth. I am 68 years old now. My nightmares have faded somewhat, worn smooth by the passage of time. I can walk in the woods near my home without freezing in terror at every shadow. I can hear an unexpected sound without reaching for a weapon that I no longer carry. But I have not forgotten. I will never forget. Sometimes, late at night when the wind is right, I think I can hear them. That low, resonant chorus drifting across the miles, carried by currents of air that should not be able to travel so far. They are singing. They are always singing. And though I cannot understand the words, I know what they mean. They are patient, they are eternal, and they are waiting. If you visit Yosemite or any of our great wild places, please be careful. Stay on the marked trails. Do not go out alone. Pay attention to the warning signs, even the ones that do not make sense. And if you ever find yourself in a place where the forest grows suddenly quiet, where the air takes on a strange thickness, and the feeling of being watched becomes impossible to ignore, do not wait to see what comes next. Run. Run as fast as you can, and do not look back. Because I have seen what lives in the shadows of our wilderness. I have looked into those eyeless faces and felt that ancient hunger. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to my very core, that they are always watching, always waiting, always hungry. And once they choose you, once they mark you as prey, there is no escape. There is only the endless forest and the gathering darkness and the sound of something massive moving through the trees behind you, getting closer with every breath. This is Thomas Brennan, signing off. I have carried this burden for 16 years. Tonight, I finally set it down. What you do with this information is up to you. Believe me, or dismiss me as a traumatized old man spinning tales to make sense of senseless tragedy. It makes no difference to me anymore. But remember what I have told you. Remember it the next time you walk into the wilderness, into those vast and beautiful spaces that seem so peaceful, so welcoming, so utterly removed from the dangers of the modern world. Remember that you are not alone out there. You never were. And whatever you do, do not go into the forest after dark, because they are waiting. They are always waiting. And sooner or later, they will find you. The recording of Thomas Brennan's account was discovered in a safe deposit box 3 years after his disappearance. Brennan had left specific instructions that the contents of the box be released to the public in the event of his death or unexplained absence. His cabin in Oregon was found undisturbed, his car parked in the driveway, his personal effects exactly as he had left them. The only item missing was his old service pistol. The official search was called off after 2 weeks. The official cause of his disappearance was listed as unknown, possibly voluntary. The case remains open, but those who knew Brennan, those who heard his story and saw the haunted look in his eyes when he told it, know better. Thomas Brennan did not leave voluntarily. Thomas Brennan did not wander off and get lost. Thomas Brennan went back. He went back to Yosemite. He went back to find the truth, and whatever truth he found, he carried it with him into the darkness. In the months following the release of Brennan's account, reports of strange sightings in Yosemite increased dramatically. Hikers spoke of shadowy figures glimpsed between the trees. Campers described sounds that did not belong to any known animal. Park rangers, speaking on condition of anonymity, confirmed that certain areas of the backcountry had been quietly closed to visitors with no public explanation. The disappearances continue. Every year, people vanish from our national parks. Most are eventually found, disoriented or injured but alive. Some are never seen again. Their families are left with questions that will never be answered, grief that will never find closure. The official explanations are always the same: animal attacks, accidental falls, the unforgiving nature of the wilderness. But there are those who know better, those who have seen what lurks in the shadows, those who understand that the beautiful wilderness we treasure is not empty, it is watching. I was never much of a camper. Growing up in Manhattan, where the closest thing to wildlife was the occasional rat scurrying across subway tracks, I developed an instinctive aversion to anything beyond the reach of public transportation. The city was my sanctuary, a concrete jungle where every corner felt familiar, filled with the aroma of street vendor hot dogs, the endless symphony of car horns, and the warm glow of streetlights that never let darkness settle in. My brother Harris was different. While I found comfort in urban chaos, he drew energy from its absence. Born just 15 months apart, we shared the same dark hair and sharp features from our mother. But that is where our similarities ended. Where I was tense and calculating, Harris moved through life with an easy, natural grace, as if he had discovered some secret to staying calm in a world that never stopped moving. We grew up in a cramped apartment on the Lower East Side, where the walls were thin enough to hear our neighbors arguing at 3 a.m, and the radiator clanked like a dying machine every winter. Our parents worked themselves to the bone trying to give us something better. Mom pulled double shifts at the hospital while Dad bounced between construction jobs and whatever else he could find. Despite the financial struggles, there was never any shortage of love in that apartment. Harris and I shared a bedroom until I left for college, and those late-night conversations shaped who we would become. I talked about spreadsheets and stock markets, about climbing corporate ladders and escaping the poverty that had defined our childhood. Harris spoke of mountains and forests, of places so remote that human voices had never echoed through them. He showed me pictures from National Geographic, pointing at vast wilderness landscapes with the kind of reverence most people reserve for religious icons. I never understood his obsession with the outdoors. To me, nature was something to be conquered, paved over, transformed into something useful. But Harris saw it differently. He saw mystery and wonder in every tree, every stream, every untouched patch of earth. By the time we were in our 20s, our paths had diverged dramatically. I had secured a position at a financial consulting firm in Midtown, working 80-hour weeks and slowly accumulating the material markers of success. Harris had become a wilderness guide, leading expeditions into some of the most remote areas of the country. He was happier than I had ever been, and I would be lying if I said that did not bother me sometimes. It was Harris who first suggested Bear Mountain State Park. He called me on a Tuesday evening in late September, his voice crackling with that familiar excitement that always preceded his most dangerous ideas. I had just gotten home from a particularly brutal day at the office, my shoulders tight with tension and my mind still racing through quarterly projections. The last thing I wanted to discuss was another one of his wilderness adventures. "Ivan," he said, not bothering with pleasantries, "I found something." Something big. I loosened my tie and collapsed onto my couch, already dreading whatever came next. What kind of something? There is this ranger position at Bear Mountain State Park. They are hiring, Ivan. The pay is not great, but the benefits are solid, and you would be working outside, away from all that corporate nonsense that is slowly killing you. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Harris, I am not going to become a park ranger. I have a career, responsibilities. I cannot just abandon everything because you think trees are more fulfilling than spreadsheets. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Harris spoke again, his voice had lost its usual lightness. This is not about trees, Ivan. This is about you. When is the last time you slept through the night? When is the last time you did something that made you actually happy? I did not have an answer for that. The truth was, I could not remember. My life had become a blur of fluorescent lights and coffee cups, of meetings that blended together and deadlines that never stopped coming. I was 32 years old and already felt ancient, worn down by the relentless grind of corporate America. Just think about it, Harris said. That is all I am asking. Come up for a weekend, see the place. If you hate it, I will never mention it again. But I have a feeling about this, Ivan. I think it could save your life. Looking back now, I understand the terrible irony of those words. Harris thought Bear Mountain could save me. He had no way of knowing what was waiting in those woods, what ancient horror had made its home among the endless trees. He could not have predicted that his suggestion would lead me down a path from which there was no return, that the forest he loved so dearly harbored something that should have remained hidden forever. But I did not know any of that then. All I knew was that my little brother had never steered me wrong before, and some part of me, buried deep beneath years of corporate conditioning, was desperate for a change. So I agreed to visit Bear Mountain for a weekend. That decision would alter the course of my life in ways I still struggle to comprehend. The drive up to Bear Mountain took less than 2 hours, but it felt like traveling to another world. The congestion of the city gradually gave way to suburban sprawl, then to rolling hills dotted with farms, and finally to dense forest that seemed to swallow the road whole. Harris had given me detailed directions, but I still managed to get lost twice, my GPS signal cutting out as I ventured deeper into the park boundaries. When I finally arrived at the ranger station, the sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson that I had never seen in Manhattan. Harris was waiting on the porch, his weathered face breaking into a grin as I pulled up in my rental car. He looked different than I remembered, more relaxed, more alive. The stress lines that had begun to appear around his eyes the last time I saw him had vanished, replaced by a healthy tan and an ease of movement that spoke of countless hours spent outdoors. "You made it," he said, pulling me into a bear hug that nearly knocked the wind out of me. "I was starting to think you had gotten cold feet." "I almost did," I admitted. "About 6 times. He laughed and led me inside the ranger station, a modest wooden structure that smelled of pine and coffee. The interior was sparse but functional, with a large map of the park covering one wall and various pieces of equipment hanging from hooks near the door. There was something comforting about the simplicity of it, something that made my over-decorated apartment in the city feel frivolous by comparison. "So, this is where the magic happens," I said, running my hand along the worn wooden counter. Harris nodded, his expression growing more serious. "This is just the administrative side. The real magic," he gestured toward the window, where the forest stretched endlessly into the gathering dusk, "is out there." He gave me a tour of the facilities, explaining the various responsibilities that came with the ranger position: trail maintenance, wildlife monitoring, visitor assistance, emergency response. It was a far cry from the financial models and client presentations that had consumed my life for the past decade. But as Harris spoke, I felt something stirring inside me, something that had been dormant for years. We ate dinner at a small cabin about half a mile from the ranger station, a place Harris had converted into his personal living quarters. The meal was simple, just grilled fish and vegetables, but it tasted better than anything I had eaten at the expensive restaurants my firm clients preferred. Maybe it was the fresh mountain air, or maybe it was the company. Either way, I found myself relaxing for the first time in months. After dinner, Harris took me on a short hike to a clearing where we could see the stars. The sky was impossibly vast, filled with more points of light than I had ever imagined possible. In Manhattan, you were lucky to see a handful of stars on the clearest nights. Here, the Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of diamonds, so bright it cast faint shadows on the ground. "This is what I wanted you to see," Harris said quietly. "This is what you are missing, stuck in that concrete prison." I did not argue with him. Standing there beneath that infinite sky, I understood for the first time what had drawn my brother to places like this. There was a peace here, a stillness that seemed to seep into your bones and quiet all the noise in your head. For those few precious moments, I forgot about deadlines and profit margins and quarterly reports. I was just a man standing beneath the stars, feeling small and insignificant, and somehow more alive than I had in years. It was during that first visit that Harris introduced me to Tyler Maddox. Tyler was the senior ranger at Bear Mountain, a grizzled veteran in his late 50s with skin like worn leather and eyes that seemed to have seen too much. He had been working the park for nearly 3 decades, longer than anyone else on staff, and there was something about him that immediately put me on edge. He greeted us outside the main ranger station the next morning, his handshake firm but brief, his gaze appraising as it swept over me. "So you are the city boy Harris keeps talking about. Thinking about joining our little family here?" I glanced at Harris, who gave me an encouraging nod. "I am considering it." Tyler studied me for a long moment, then grunted in a way that could have meant anything. City people usually do not last long out here. They come up thinking it is going to be some kind of vacation, all campfires and nature walks. They do not understand what the forest really is. "And what is that?" I asked, annoyed by his dismissive tone. He turned to look at the tree line, his expression unreadable. "Old. That is what it is. Older than any of us can imagine. And old things, they have long memories. They do not take kindly to strangers." I assumed he was just trying to scare me, engaging in some kind of hazing ritual reserved for newcomers. Harris certainly seemed to think so, judging by the way he rolled his eyes behind Tyler's back. But there was something in the older ranger's voice that did not quite fit with simple intimidation. It sounded almost like a warning. The weekend passed quickly, filled with hikes and wildlife sightings and conversations that went deeper than any I had had in years. By the time I drove back to the city on Sunday evening, my decision was made. I would take the ranger position. I would leave behind everything I had worked for and start over in a place where the stars were visible and the air did not taste like exhaust fumes. My colleagues thought I had lost my mind. My boss offered me a raise, then a promotion, then finally just shook his head in bewildered disappointment when I submitted my resignation. My apartment sold faster than expected, and within 2 months of that first visit, I was officially a ranger at Bear Mountain State Park. The transition was not easy. My body, softened by years of desk work, protested every physical demand the job required. My mind, conditioned to thrive on constant stimulation, struggled with the long stretches of solitude that came with patrolling remote sections of the park. But Harris was patient, just as he had always been, and slowly I began to adapt. Those first few months were some of the best of my life. I lost weight and gained muscle. I learned to read the forest, to recognize the subtle signs that indicated changes in weather or wildlife activity. I discovered a capacity for peace that I had not known existed within me. The nightmares that had plagued me in the city, stress dreams about missed deadlines and failed presentations, gradually faded away, replaced by dreamless sleep that left me feeling genuinely rested for the first time in years. But even during those idyllic early days, there were hints that something was not quite right at Bear Mountain. Little things mostly, easy to dismiss or explain away. The way certain sections of the park always felt colder than they should, even in summer. The strange reluctance of wildlife to venture into specific areas, leaving patches of forest eerily devoid of animal life. The occasional hiker who would emerge from the trails looking shaken, struggling to articulate what had frightened them, but clearly deeply disturbed. And then there were the stories. Tyler Maddox was not the only longtime resident who spoke of Bear Mountain with a mixture of reverence and fear. The locals, people whose families had lived in the shadow of these mountains for generations, had their own tales to tell. Stories passed down from parents and grandparents about things that walked in the deep woods, about sounds that came from nowhere and everywhere at once, about people who ventured too far into the wilderness and were never seen again. I dismissed most of these accounts as folklore, the kind of campfire tales that every rural community cultivates to entertain tourists and frighten children. But there was one story that stuck with me, one that I heard multiple times from multiple sources, always told in the same hushed, reluctant tone. They called it the Hollow Man. The descriptions varied slightly depending on who was telling the story, but certain details remained consistent. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long and joints that bent in ways that made your eyes hurt to look at. It moved through the forest without making a sound, and where it walked, silence followed. Animals would not cross its path. Plants would wither and die, and anyone who saw it, who truly saw it, would be marked, claimed. It was only a matter of time before the Hollow Man came back for them. I laughed the first time I heard this story, told by an old-timer at the local bar after one too many beers. But the look he gave me in response killed my amusement instantly. It was a look of genuine pity, the kind of expression you might wear when speaking to someone who has just received a terminal diagnosis. "Laugh all you want, city boy," he said quietly. "But there is a reason people do not go into the deep woods alone. There is a reason even the rangers stick to the marked trails. Some things are older than us, older than the mountains themselves, and they do not like being disturbed." I thought about that conversation more than I wanted to admit in the weeks that followed. And when the disappearances started, I remembered it with a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn temperatures. The first one happened in early October, about 6 months after I had started my new career. A hiker named Gabriel Reyes failed to return from a solo day trip on one of the park's more challenging trails. His car was found in the parking lot, his registration slip still displayed on the dashboard, but Gabriel himself had vanished without a trace. The search lasted a week. I was part of the team that combed through miles of wilderness, calling his name until our voices went hoarse, looking for any sign of where he might have gone. We found nothing, no body, no equipment, no indication of what had happened to him. It was as if Gabriel Reyes had simply ceased to exist somewhere along that trail. "These things happen," Tyler told me after the search was finally called off. "People underestimate the wilderness. They make mistakes, take wrong turns, fall into ravines or rivers. Sometimes we find them, sometimes we do not." But something in his voice suggested he did not entirely believe his own explanation. And when I pressed him for details about similar cases in the park's history, his expression shuddered in a way that told me the conversation was over. I did my own research after that. The county library had archives going back decades, and what I found there kept me awake for several nights. Gabriel Reyes was not the first person to disappear in Bear Mountain State Park. He was not even the 10th. Over the past 100 years, dozens of people had vanished within the park boundaries, and the pattern was disturbing in its consistency. They were always alone. They always disappeared from the same general area, a remote section of the park that locals called the Hollow, though I could not find that name on any official map, and they were never found, not a single one of them. No bodies, no bones, no closure for the families left behind. They simply walked into the forest and never walked out again. I brought my findings to Harris, expecting him to dismiss my concerns as the paranoid imaginings of a city boy who had read too many horror novels. Instead, he listened in silence, his expression growing increasingly troubled as I laid out the evidence. "I have heard stories," he admitted when I finished. "The other rangers, the ones who have been here longer, they talk sometimes. Late at night, after a few drinks. They say there is something in the Hollow, something that has been there since before the park existed. Before the town existed. Before anything existed." "What kind of something?" He shrugged, but the gesture was stiff, uncomfortable. "Nobody knows for sure. Or if they do know, they are not saying. But Tyler, he told me once that there are places in this park where the rules are different. Where the forest is not just old, but ancient in a way that makes old seem young. He said that whatever is in those places, it is not hostile exactly. It is just hungry, always hungry, and it has been feeding for a very long time." I wanted to dismiss his words as superstition, as the kind of irrational fear that thrives in isolated communities where education is limited and imagination runs wild. but I could not shake the feeling that Harris was holding something back, that there was more to this story than he was willing to share. That night, I dreamed of Gabriel Reyes. He was walking through the forest, his hiking boots crunching on fallen leaves, his breath misting in the cold air. He seemed happy, content, completely unaware of what was following him. I tried to call out, to warn him, but no sound came from my throat. I could only watch as the shadows between the trees began to move, coalescing into something tall and thin and impossibly wrong. Gabriel never saw it coming. One moment he was there, solid and real, and the next he was simply gone, swallowed by a darkness that should not have existed in broad daylight. I woke up gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat, the taste of copper in my mouth. Through my cabin window, the forest loomed in the pre-dawn darkness, and for just a moment I could have sworn I saw something moving between the trees. Something tall, something watching. The second disappearance happened 3 weeks later. Maya Rook was an experienced outdoors woman, a former Marine who had completed survival courses that would make most people weep with exhaustion. She had come to Bear Mountain to test herself, to push her limits in one of the most challenging wilderness environments on the East Coast. She had all the right equipment, all the right training, all the right instincts. None of it mattered. Her campsite was found intact, her tent still standing, her fire pit still warm. Her food was hanging from a branch exactly as protocol dictated, untouched by the bears and raccoons that usually ravaged unattended supplies. Her pack was there, her water filter, her satellite phone. But Maya herself had vanished, leaving behind nothing but a set of footprints that led into the forest and simply stopped, as if she had been lifted straight up into the air. I was the one who found the campsite. I still remember the way my stomach dropped when I saw those footprints, the way my skin crawled as I realized their implications. There was no struggle, no sign of an animal attack, no indication that anything violent had occurred. Maya Rook had walked into the woods, and the woods had taken her. The official report listed her disappearance as unexplained, the bureaucratic equivalent of a shrug. But I knew better. I had seen the area where her footprints ended, had felt the unnatural cold that hung over that patch of forest like a shroud. Whatever had taken Gabriel Reyes had taken Maya too, and I was beginning to understand that it would not stop there. I tried to talk to Tyler about it, to share my theories and fears, but he shut me down with a ferocity that surprised me. "Some things are not meant to be understood," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Some questions are not meant to be asked. You want to survive in this job, you learn where the lines are, and you do not cross them." "What about the people who are disappearing?" I demanded. "Do we just accept that? Do we just let it keep happening?" Something shifted in his expression then, a fleeting glimpse of pain that he quickly suppressed. "We do not let anything happen. We are not in control here. We never have been. The best we can do is minimize the damage, keep people away from the places they should not go, and hope that is enough." It was not enough. I knew it then, and I know it now. But Tyler was right about one thing. I was not in control. None of us were. We were guests in that forest, tolerated visitors in a realm that operated by rules far older and stranger than anything human law could comprehend. The months that followed were some of the darkest of my life. I threw myself into research, spending every free moment digging through historical records, interviewing locals, trying to piece together the truth about Bear Mountain and the thing that lived in its depths. What I found was both illuminating and terrifying. The disappearances went back further than I had initially discovered, much further. Native American tribes had avoided this area for centuries, their oral histories describing it as a place where the world was thin, where things could cross over from elsewhere. Early European settlers had lost people here too, trappers and hunters who ventured into the deep woods and never returned. And in the decades since the park was established, the pattern had continued with grim regularity. Every few years, someone would vanish, always alone, always in the same general area, always without explanation. I found journal entries from previous rangers, men and women who had worked Bear Mountain long before I arrived. Many of them described experiences similar to mine, the feeling of being watched, the patches of unnatural cold, the dreams that felt more like memories of something terrible. Some of them had tried to investigate, to understand what was happening. Those rangers tended to leave the job abruptly, citing personal reasons or health concerns. A few of them had disappeared themselves, their fates recorded in the same clinical language used for the hikers they had once searched for. One journal in particular stayed with me. It belonged to a ranger named Catherine Walsh, who had worked Bear Mountain in the 1970s. Her entries started out normal enough, routine observations about weather patterns and wildlife sightings. But as the pages progressed, her tone changed. She wrote about hearing voices in the forest, whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She described seeing figures in her peripheral vision, tall and thin and somehow wrong, figures that vanished whenever she tried to look at them directly. Her final entry, dated October 15th, 1978, was brief and chilling. It knows I have been watching it. I can feel its attention, like ice on the back of my neck. Tonight I am going into the hollow. I need to understand. I need to see it for myself. God forgive me for what I am about to do. Catherine Walsh was never seen again. Her cabin was found empty, her belongings undisturbed. Her car still parked in the same spot where she had left it. Like all the others, she had simply vanished, swallowed by a forest that kept its secrets well. I should have left then. I should have packed my bags and driven back to Manhattan, back to the safe, predictable world of traffic jams and skyscrapers and artificial light. But something held me there. Some combination of stubbornness and guilt and morbid curiosity that I still cannot fully explain. Harris was still at Bear Mountain, still working the trails he loved, still refusing to acknowledge the danger that lurked in the deep woods. I could not abandon him. I could not abandon the mystery that had consumed my every waking thought. And so I stayed. I stayed, and I watched, and I waited. I stayed until the forest came for someone I loved, and by then, it was too late to do anything but run. The night it happened started like any other autumn evening. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, the trees ablaze with color that would soon fade to bare branches and empty silence. Harris and I had dinner together at my cabin, something we tried to do at least once a week, a small ritual that kept us connected even as the demands of the job pulled us in different directions. We talked about nothing important, the way brothers do. Harris complained about a group of tourists who had ignored his warnings about staying on marked trails. I shared a story about a particularly aggressive raccoon that had developed a taste for granola bars. For a few hours, everything felt normal. Everything felt safe. It was around midnight when the radio crackled to life, a distress call, automated, coming from somewhere in the northern section of the park. The signal was weak and intermittent, but the location it indicated made my blood run cold. The hollow. Someone was in the hollow, and they were in trouble. Harris grabbed his gear before I could stop him. "I am going," he said, his voice carrying that stubborn edge I knew so well. "Someone needs help." "Not there," I pleaded. "Harris, you know what happens to people who go there. Call for backup. Wait until morning. Just do not go into the hollow alone." He paused at the door, looking back at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was equal parts fear and determination. The look of someone who knows exactly what they are walking into and chooses to walk anyway. "Someone is in trouble, Ivan. Maybe I can help. Maybe I cannot. But I am not going to sit here and do nothing while another person disappears." "Then I am coming with you," I said, reaching for my own equipment. But Harris shook his head. "No, you stay here, monitor the radio. If I am not back by sunrise, call it in. Get everyone you can and come looking for me. Harris, please." He crossed the room and pulled me into a hug, holding me tight for just a moment. "I love you, big brother. I will be fine. I will see you in a few hours." Those were the last words my brother ever spoke to me. I watched him disappear into the darkness, his flashlight beam bobbing between the trees until it was swallowed by the forest's endless black. I stayed up all night, monitoring the radio, waiting for a signal that never came. By sunrise, I knew. By sunrise, I was already mourning. The search for Harris lasted longer than any of the previous ones. I would not let them stop. I walked those trails until my feet bled, screamed his name until my voice was nothing but a ragged whisper, pushed deeper into the hollow than anyone had gone in years. I found his flashlight first, lying in a patch of withered vegetation where nothing grew. Then his radio, the casing cracked, the battery dead. Then his jacket, hanging from a branch like a flag of surrender. But I never found Harris. I never found my brother. Like all the others before him, he had simply ceased to exist, erased from the world by something that did not play by human rules. I resigned from the Ranger Service the day the search was officially called off. Tyler tried to stop me, tried to tell me that leaving would not bring Harris back, that running from Bear Mountain would not change what had happened. But I could not stay. I could not spend another night in that cabin, looking out at the forest that had stolen everything from me. I could not walk those trails knowing my brother had walked them too, that he had trusted the wilderness he loved, and it had betrayed him in the worst possible way. The years since then have not been kind. I moved around a lot at first, unable to settle anywhere for long, haunted by memories and dreams and the constant feeling that something was following me, waiting for me to let my guard down. I tried therapy, tried medication, tried drowning my sorrows in bottles and pills and anything else that promised oblivion. Nothing worked. Nothing could erase what I had seen, what I had lost, what I knew to be true about the world. Eventually, I found my way back to the city. Not Manhattan. I could not bear to return to the place where Harris and I had grown up, but another city, far away, where the lights never went out and the noise never stopped. I took a job that required nothing more than showing up and going through the motions. I rented an apartment that felt like a prison cell, but at least had walls that kept the darkness at bay. I survived, which I suppose is the most anyone can ask for. But I never forgot Bear Mountain. I never forgot the Hollow, or the thing that lived there, or the brother it had taken from me. And as the years passed, I began to hear stories, accounts from other places, other forests, other parks where people disappeared under similar circumstances. The names and locations changed, but the pattern was always the same. Lone hikers vanishing without a trace. Footprints that ended in the middle of nowhere. A feeling of being watched, of being hunted, of being marked by something that had no name and no face and no mercy. I started collecting these stories, documenting them, looking for connections that others had missed. It became my obsession, my reason for getting out of bed in the morning, the only thing that gave my broken life any sense of purpose. I corresponded with other survivors, people who had lost loved ones to the wilderness, people who had seen things they could not explain, people who understood the terrible truth that lurked beneath the surface of the natural world. That is how I ended up back at Bear Mountain. 20 years after Harris disappeared, I received a message from a ranger named Sarah Chen. She had found my research online, had recognized the patterns I described, had reached out because she was desperate and frightened and did not know where else to turn. "The disappearances have started again," she wrote. 3 in the past 6 months, all in the Hollow. I need to know what you know. I need to understand what we are dealing with. I should have told her to run. I should have warned her that understanding would not help, that knowledge would not protect her, that the only way to survive was to leave and never look back. But I did not say any of those things. Instead, I booked a flight and a rental car and made the drive up to Bear Mountain for the first time in 2 decades. The park had changed since I left, and yet it had not changed at all. The ranger station had been renovated, the trails widened and improved, the facilities modernized to accommodate a new generation of outdoor enthusiasts, but the forest itself was the same, ancient and patient and hungry, waiting for the next victim to wander too deep into its embrace. Sarah Chen was younger than I expected, barely 30, with a determination in her eyes that reminded me painfully of Harris. She had only been working at Bear Mountain for 2 years, but already she had seen enough to shake her faith in the orderly universe most people take for granted. She listened as I told her everything I knew, about the Hollow, about the disappearances, about the thing that had taken my brother and countless others before him. She did not interrupt, did not question, did not dismiss my account as the ravings of a traumatized old man. She simply listened, and when I was finished, she nodded slowly. "I believe you," she said. "I have seen things, heard things, felt things that I cannot explain. But I need to do more than believe. I need to stop it. Is that possible? Can whatever is doing this be stopped?" I did not have an answer for her. In all my years of research, I had never found any evidence that the thing in the Hollow could be defeated or destroyed. It was not a creature in any conventional sense, not an animal that could be hunted or a phenomenon that could be studied. It was something else. Something older and stranger and more fundamental, a part of the forest itself in some way I could not articulate, but I could not tell Sarah that. I could not crush the hope in her eyes the way my own hope had been crushed so many years ago. So I told her what I knew, which was not enough, and I promised to help her find answers, which I was not sure existed. We spent weeks going through old records, interviewing locals, exploring the edges of the Hollow without ever quite crossing into its heart. Sarah was methodical and brave, qualities that would serve her well in most circumstances, but that I feared would prove insufficient against what we were facing. I tried to convince her to be careful, to maintain her distance, to observe without engaging, but she was young and determined and convinced that there had to be a solution, a way to end the cycle of disappearances once and for all. The night she went into the hollow alone, I was asleep in my motel room, dreaming of Harris. In the dream, he was walking through the forest, his voice calling out to me, asking me to follow, to come with him, to see what he had seen. I woke up with his name on my lips and a terrible certainty in my chest. I drove to the ranger station as fast as I could, my hands shaking on the wheel, my heart pounding with a fear I had hoped to never feel again. Sarah's car was in the parking lot. Her equipment was gone. The sign-out sheet showed her destination, the same coordinates that had appeared on that distress call 20 years ago. The Hollow. I should not have gone after her. I know that now. I knew it then too, but the knowledge did not stop me. I grabbed a flashlight and a radio, and I walked into the darkness, following the same path my brother had taken all those years ago, heading toward the same terrible destination. The forest changed as I moved deeper. The trees grew older and more twisted, their branches reaching toward each other to form a canopy so thick that even the full moon's light could not penetrate. The temperature dropped, not gradually but all at once, as if I had crossed some invisible threshold into a different world. The sounds of the forest, the insects and birds and rustling leaves fell away until there was nothing but silence and my own labored breathing. I found Sarah at the edge of a clearing I did not recognize. She was standing perfectly still, her flashlight hanging limply from one hand, her eyes fixed on something I could not see. Her face was pale, expressionless, empty of everything that had made her Sarah. "Sarah," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, we need to go. We need to leave right now." She did not respond. She did not even seem to hear me. She just stood there, staring into the darkness, waiting for something that was already on its way. I felt it before I saw it. A pressure in my chest, a ringing in my ears, a sense of something vast and ancient and utterly indifferent to human existence. The shadows between the trees began to shift and coalesce, forming a shape that my mind refused to fully process. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that bent at wrong angles and a head that was less a face than an absence, a void where features should have been. The Hollow Man. After all these years, I was finally seeing it for myself. Time seemed to stop. The world narrowed to that clearing, to that impossible figure, to the woman who stood transfixed by its presence. I wanted to run, every instinct screaming at me to flee, but my legs would not obey. I was frozen, paralyzed, a mouse caught in the gaze of a snake that had no eyes. And then Sarah spoke. Just one word, barely audible, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "Beautiful." She took a step forward. Then another. Walking toward the thing, the horror, the impossibility that stood waiting for her. I tried to call out, tried to stop her, but no sound came from my throat. I could only watch as she drew closer and closer to the darkness, her form growing smaller, fainter, less real with every step. At the last moment, she turned and looked at me. Her eyes were different now, filled with something that might have been peace or might have been surrender. "Thank you," she said, "for trying." And then she was gone. Swallowed by the shadow, absorbed by the void, erased from existence as completely as if she had never been. The Hollow Man turned its eyeless gaze toward me, and I felt its attention like a weight pressing down on my soul. It was considering me, evaluating me, deciding whether I was worth the effort of consumption. In that moment, I understood something that all my research had failed to reveal. The thing in the hollow was not evil in any human sense of the word. It did not hate us or wish us harm. It was simply hungry, with a hunger that had no beginning and would have no end, a hunger that had been feeding on human beings for longer than memory or history could record. We were nothing to it. Less than nothing. Brief flickers of warmth and consciousness that it consumed the way we might consume a passing meal. And yet, for reasons I still cannot explain, it let me go. The pressure in my chest eased, the ringing in my ears faded, and suddenly I could move again, could turn and run, could crash through the underbrush without caring about direction or consequence. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, until I collapsed at the edge of the forest, sobbing and shaking and utterly broken. I left Bear Mountain the next morning. I did not wait to give a statement, did not try to explain what had happened, did not do any of the things that a responsible person would have done. I simply got in my car and drove, putting as many miles between myself and that terrible place as I could manage. That was 5 years ago. I am an old man now, older than I have any right to be, living in a small house on the outskirts of a city where the lights never go out. I do not go outside after dark. I do not visit parks or forests or anywhere that trees grow thick and the shadows linger. I have accepted that there are parts of the world that belong to something other than us, places where the rules we take for granted do not apply and never have. But I still dream of Bear Mountain. I dream of Harris, walking into the darkness with his flashlight held high, convinced that he could make a difference. I dream of Sarah Chen, her face peaceful as she stepped into oblivion. I dream of all the others, the countless victims who wandered into the hollow over centuries, who were consumed by something they could not understand and would never escape. And sometimes, when the dreams are particularly vivid, I hear a voice calling to me from the darkness. It sounds like Harris, like the brother I lost all those years ago, asking me to come back, to join him, to finally understand what he discovered in that terrible clearing. The voice is seductive, comforting, filled with a peace that I have not known since I first set foot in those accursed woods. I know it is not really Harris. I know it is the thing in the hollow, reaching out across the miles and years, trying to draw me back into its embrace. But on the darkest nights, when the loneliness becomes too much to bear, I find myself wondering if it would really be so bad to see my brother again, to feel that terrible peace, to finally stop running from a truth that has defined my entire existence. I have not given in yet. I do not know if I ever will, but the voice keeps calling, patient and eternal, and I am getting old. One day, perhaps, I will be too tired to resist. One day, I will turn toward that voice and start walking, heading back to Bear Mountain, back to the hollow, back to the hungry darkness that waits for us all. Until then, I write these words as a warning. Do not go into the deep woods alone. Do not trust the silence that falls between the trees. Do not follow voices that call from places you cannot see. There are things in this world that are older than humanity, hungrier than we can imagine, and utterly indifferent to our survival. They have been waiting since before we existed, and they will be waiting long after we are gone. If you ever find yourself at Bear Mountain State Park, stick to the marked trails. Do not venture into the areas the rangers tell you to avoid. And if you feel something watching you from the shadows, if you hear whispers that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, if the temperature drops for no reason and the forest goes suddenly, impossibly silent, then run. Run and do not look back. Run and pray that you are fast enough, lucky enough, insignificant enough to escape. Because the Hollow Man is always hungry, and it has very, very long patience. I sit here now in my small house, the lights burning bright against the encroaching darkness outside my windows. The television plays in the background, a constant murmur of human voices that keeps the silence at bay. I have learned to sleep with the lights on, to never let complete darkness settle over me, to surround myself with the sounds and sights of civilization as a barrier against what waits in the wild places of the world. But barriers only work for so long, and some barriers were never meant to hold forever. Last week, I received a letter. It had no return address, no postmark, no indication of where it had come from or who had sent it. Inside was a single photograph, old and faded, showing a clearing in a forest that I recognized immediately despite the passage of 25 years. The Hollow. And standing at the edge of that clearing, barely visible in the dappled shadows, was a figure that made my heart stop. It was Harris. Or something wearing his face, his body, his familiar stance. He was looking directly at the camera, directly at whoever would one day hold this photograph, and he was smiling. But it was not Harris's smile. There was something wrong about it, something stretched and empty, like a mask that did not quite fit the face beneath. On the back of the photograph, someone had written 4 words in handwriting that was almost but not quite my brother's. "We are waiting, Ivan." I burned the photograph. I burned it and scattered the ashes and tried to convince myself that it was just a prank. Just someone's sick idea of a joke. But I know better. I have always known better. The thing in the hollow does not forget. It does not give up. And it does not let go. I am 72 years old. My hands shake when I try to write. My legs ache when I walk. I cannot run anymore, cannot flee, cannot do any of the things that kept me alive all those years ago. If the Hollow Man comes for me now, I will not be able to escape. I will simply have to face it, to look into that eyeless void and accept whatever fate awaits me. Part of me welcomes that thought. Part of me is tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of being afraid every moment of every day. Part of me wants to see Harris again, even if the thing that wears his face is not really him, even if joining him means surrendering to an oblivion I cannot imagine. But another part of me refuses to give in. Another part of me remembers the brother who taught me to start a fire with wet wood, who showed me the stars on that first night at Bear Mountain, who believed in me even when I did not believe in myself. That Harris would not want me to surrender, that Harris would want me to keep fighting, keep warning others, keep trying to save people from the fate that claimed him. So I write these words. I write them for anyone who will listen, anyone who might find themselves drawn to the wild places of the world, anyone who has ever felt the forest watching them with ancient, hungry eyes. I write them because it is the only thing I can still do, the only way I can still honor my brother's memory and try to prevent others from sharing his fate. Bear Mountain State Park is still open. People still hike its trails, still camp in its clearings, still venture into places they should not go. The hollow is still there, waiting, hungry, patient beyond all human understanding. And the thing that lives within it is still feeding, still taking, still erasing human beings from existence one by one. I cannot stop it. Nobody can. But maybe, if enough people read these words, if enough people heed this warning, fewer victims will wander into its embrace. Maybe some mother will decide not to let her children camp in that particular section of the park. Maybe some hiker will choose a different trail, a different forest, a different destination. Maybe some life will be saved because of what I have written here. That is the hope I cling to as the darkness gathers outside my windows. That is the thought that lets me face another night, another day, another endless cycle of fear and memory and regret. I cannot undo what happened to Harris. I cannot bring back Sarah Chen or Gabriel Reyes or Maya Rook or any of the countless others who have been consumed by the hollow. But maybe I can prevent one more disappearance. Maybe I can save one more life. And if I cannot, if this account falls on deaf ears and the disappearances continue and the thing in the hollow keeps feeding, then at least I will have tried. At least I will have done something other than hide and wait for the end to find me. The voice is calling again tonight. I can hear it on the edge of sleep, whispering through the static of my television, seeping through the cracks in my carefully constructed defenses. It sounds so much like Harris. It sounds so much like peace. But I will not answer. Not tonight. Tonight I will keep writing, keep warning, keep fighting in the only way I have left. Tomorrow may be different. Tomorrow the voice may be too strong, the loneliness too overwhelming, the fear too exhausting to resist anymore. But that is tomorrow's problem. Tonight I am still here. Tonight I am still warning you. Do not go into the deep woods alone. Do not trust the silence. Do not follow the voices. My name is Arthur Jenkins, and what I am about to tell you should have stayed buried in those woods. It was October 1987 when I took that assignment in the Appalachian National Forests. A routine patrol, they said. Just check on some remote campsites, investigate reports of illegal hunting. I was a rookie ranger back then, 29 years old, still believing the forest held no secrets I could not handle. There were 4 of us at the station that morning. Myself, Daniel Wright, Thomas Caldwell, and Sarah Morrison. By nightfall, I would learn that some things in those ancient woods do not want to be found, and some hunts are not what they seem. What we stumbled upon that day changed everything I thought I knew about those mountains. 40 years later, I still wake up hearing sounds no animal should make, seeing shapes that move between the trees in ways that defy explanation. I need you to understand something before I continue. I am not a storyteller. I am not a man prone to flights of fancy or supernatural beliefs. For 32 years after I left the Ranger Service, I worked as a county surveyor in Ohio. I raised 2 children. I attended church on Sundays. I paid my taxes and mowed my lawn and lived the most ordinary life imaginable. I did everything in my power to forget what happened in those mountains. But some memories refuse to stay buried. Some truths demand to be told, no matter how impossible they sound. And now, at 71 years old, with more of my life behind me than ahead, I have decided that the world needs to know what lurks in the deep places of the Appalachian wilderness. Whether you believe me or not is your choice, but I swear on my grandchildren that every word of what follows is true. The Appalachian National Forests stretch across millions of acres, encompassing some of the oldest mountains on Earth. These are not the dramatic peaks of the Rockies or the pristine wilderness of Alaska. These are ancient, weathered mountains that have stood for hundreds of millions of years, their slopes covered in dense hardwood forests that have witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. The Cherokee called these mountains sacred. The early European settlers whispered about things that lived in the hollows, creatures that predated human memory. Even today, hikers go missing in these woods at rates that defy statistical explanation. Most are found eventually, lost, dehydrated, sometimes injured. But some are never found at all, and some are found in conditions that the official reports struggle to explain. I arrived at the Nantahala Ranger Station on September 15, 1987, fresh from my training at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Georgia. I had grown up in Charlotte, North Carolina, close enough to the mountains to feel their pull, but far enough away that I had never truly understood their vastness. My father had been a police officer, and his father before him. Law enforcement was in my blood, but I had always been drawn to the outdoors, to the quiet solitude of nature, rather than the chaos of city streets. The Forest Service seemed like the perfect compromise, a chance to serve my community while immersing myself in the wilderness I loved. The station itself was a modest building, a single-story structure of brown timber and green metal roofing that blended into the surrounding forest. It sat at the end of a gravel road, 15 miles from the nearest town, and surrounded on all sides by dense stands of oak, hickory, and maple. In October, the leaves were just beginning to turn, splashing the mountainsides with brilliant oranges and reds. It was beautiful in a way that photographs could never capture, the kind of beauty that made you understand why people had lived and died in these mountains for thousands of years. Daniel Wright was the senior ranger at the station, a grizzled man in his early 50s with a salt and pepper beard and eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. He had worked in the Appalachians for nearly 30 years, starting as a seasonal firefighter before working his way up to a permanent law enforcement position. He did not talk much, but when he did, you listened. There was a weight to his words that suggested he had seen things he would never speak about, things that had left permanent marks on his soul. Thomas Caldwell was closer to my age, 34, with a wife and young daughter waiting for him in the small town of Andrews, about an hour away. He was friendly and outgoing, the kind of guy who could strike up a conversation with anyone and make them feel like an old friend within minutes. He had worked at the station for 6 years and seemed to know every trail, every hollow, every hidden waterfall in our jurisdiction. If Daniel was the heart of the station, Thomas was its voice. Sarah Morrison was the only woman among us, a fact that never seemed to bother her in the slightest. She was 31, tall and athletic, with auburn hair that she kept tied back in a practical ponytail. She had come to the Forest Service from a career in wildlife biology and had a particular expertise in tracking and identifying animal behavior. More than once, I would see her examine a set of tracks or a patch of disturbed vegetation and deduce things that seemed almost supernatural in their accuracy. She was also the most skeptical person I had ever met, dismissing anything that could not be explained by science with a wave of her hand and a roll of her eyes. The four of us made up the entire law enforcement presence for nearly 100,000 acres of wilderness. During peak season, we might have seasonal workers to help with campground patrols and visitor assistance, but by October, most of them had returned to school or moved on to other jobs. The forest was quieting down, the summer crowds replaced by serious hikers and hunters who knew how to take care of themselves. It should have been an easy time, a chance to catch our breath before the long winter months ahead. It started with the reports from Blackwater Hollow. Blackwater Hollow was a remote drainage on the eastern edge of our jurisdiction, a steep-sided valley carved by a creek that ran dark with tannins from the surrounding hemlock forest. It was not a popular destination for hikers. The terrain was too rugged, the trails too poorly maintained, but it was known among local hunters as prime territory for wild boar, and during hunting season, it attracted a steady trickle of men with rifles and camouflage clothing. The first report came on October 3rd. A hunter named Paul Whitmore had called the station from a payphone in town, claiming that someone had been watching him from the woods while he was setting up camp the previous night. He described a figure standing just beyond the reach of his campfire light, motionless and silent, visible only as a darker shape against the already dark forest. When he had called out, the figure had not responded. When he had reached for his rifle, it had simply vanished, melting back into the darkness without a sound. Daniel took the call and wrote it up in the daily log, marking it as a possible trespasser or poacher. Hunters were notoriously territorial, and it was not uncommon for conflicts to arise over prime hunting spots. He assigned Thomas to make a sweep of the area the following day, more as a precaution than anything else. Thomas returned that evening looking troubled. He had found Paul Whitmore's campsite without difficulty, the fire ring still visible, the ground scuffed where his tent had been pitched. But he had also found something else. About a quarter-mile from the campsite, in a small clearing surrounded by ancient hemlocks, he had discovered a circle of stones arranged in a pattern he did not recognize. The stones were river rocks, smooth and dark, each one roughly the size of a fist. They had been placed with obvious care, forming a shape that Thomas described as something like a spiral with spokes radiating outward. In the center of the circle was a small pile of animal bones, deer, he thought, though some of them were so old and weathered that it was hard to tell. Daniel examined the photographs Thomas had taken and said nothing for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and expressionless. "Kids," he said, "probably some teenagers messing around trying to scare hunters. We will keep an eye on the area." But I saw something in his eyes that contradicted his dismissive tone, a flicker of recognition that he quickly suppressed. Sarah noticed it too. That night, after Daniel had gone home and Thomas had left to see his family, she pulled me aside in the station's small break room. "He knows something," she said. "I have worked with Daniel for 4 years, and I have never seen him look like that." I asked her what she thought we should do. "Nothing yet," she replied, "but keep your eyes open. And if you see anything strange out there, do not try to investigate alone. Radio in and wait for backup." I nodded, not entirely sure what she meant by strange. I was about to find out. The second report came on October 8th. This time, it was not a phone call, but a personal visit. A man named Fred Dawson showed up at the station around noon, still wearing his hunting clothes and looking like he had not slept in days. His hands were shaking, and his eyes kept darting toward the windows, as if he expected something to come crashing through at any moment. Daniel was out on patrol, so I was the one who took his statement. Fred was a local, a retired mechanic who had been hunting these mountains for 40 years. He knew the land as well as anyone, and he was not the type to spook easily. But as he told me what had happened, I could see genuine fear in his eyes. He had been hunting in Blackwater Hollow, he said, following a game trail that led deep into the drainage. Around mid-afternoon, he had come across something that stopped him cold. It was a cabin, or what was left of one, a structure of rotting logs and collapsed timbers that he had never seen before, despite decades of wandering these woods. That alone was strange enough. But what truly disturbed him was what he found inside. The cabin was old, impossibly old, the logs gray and soft with rot. The roof had long since collapsed, leaving the interior exposed to the elements. But among the debris, Fred had found evidence of recent habitation. There were empty cans of food, modern brands that he recognized from the grocery store in town. There were scraps of fabric that looked like they had come from hiking gear. And there was blood. Not a lot, not enough to suggest serious injury, but unmistakable dark stains on the rotting floorboards and splattered across one of the remaining walls. Fred had gotten out of there as fast as he could. He had not stopped moving until he reached his truck, parked at a trailhead nearly 3 miles away. And the whole time, he said, he had felt like something was watching him, tracking his progress through the forest with patient, predatory attention. I radioed Daniel and relayed Fred's account. There was a long pause before he responded, long enough that I thought we might have lost the signal. Then his voice crackled through the speaker, tight and controlled. "Stay at the station. I will be there in 30 minutes. Do not let Fred leave." We waited. Sarah returned from her own patrol, and I briefed her on the situation. She examined Fred with clinical detachment, noting his elevated heart rate, his dilated pupils, his persistent tremor. He was exhibiting classic signs of acute stress, she said, consistent with a genuine traumatic experience. Whatever he had seen out there, he believed it completely. Daniel arrived exactly when he said he would. He listened to Fred repeat his story, asking occasional questions about landmarks and distances. When Fred was finished, Daniel thanked him for coming in and told him to go home, to stay out of the woods for a while. Fred did not argue. After he left, Daniel gathered the 3 of us around the map table in the station's main room. He traced a route with his finger, following the contours of Blackwater Hollow. "I know that cabin," he said quietly. "Or at least, I knew it. It burned down in 1952. Sarah started to object, to point out the obvious impossibility of what Daniel was suggesting, but something in his expression stopped her. "There are things in these mountains," Daniel continued, "that do not follow the rules we are used to. Things that have been here since before the Cherokee, before any human being set foot on this continent. Most of the time they keep to themselves. They stay in the deep places, the hollows and gaps where nobody goes. But sometimes something stirs them up. And when that happens, people go missing. I asked him what kind of things. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes weighing and measuring. I do not know what to call them, he finally said. Spirits, maybe. Demons. The old-timers around here have a lot of names for them, none of them pleasant. All I know is that I have seen what they can do, and I have learned to recognize the signs when they start to wake up. He assigned us our duties for the following day. Thomas and I would investigate Fred's cabin, following his directions as closely as possible. Sarah would canvass the nearby towns, checking with local law enforcement and the ranger stations in adjacent jurisdictions for any similar reports. Daniel himself would remain at the station, coordinating our efforts and standing by in case we needed backup. I did not sleep well that night. My quarters were a small cabin about 100 yards from the main station, one of 4 identical structures arranged in a loose semicircle around a central fire pit. The cabin was comfortable enough, a single room with a bed, a desk, a wood stove, and a tiny bathroom. But that night it felt claustrophobic, the walls pressing in as darkness gathered outside the windows. Every sound seemed amplified. The creak of settling timbers, the skitter of mice in the walls, the distant hoot of a great horned owl, each one made me flinch, made me reach instinctively for the service weapon I kept on my nightstand. I kept the curtains drawn but could not shake the feeling that something was watching me, that if I opened them I would see a face pressed against the glass. When dawn finally came, gray and cold and shrouded in mist, I felt more exhausted than when I had gone to bed, but I forced myself up, forced myself through my morning routine, forced myself to eat a breakfast I did not want. By the time Thomas arrived at the station, I had almost convinced myself that my fears were unfounded, that the events of the past few days had simply activated some primal part of my brain that had no place in the modern world. We drove as far as the roads would take us, then continued on foot. The mist had thickened as the morning progressed, reducing visibility to perhaps 50 yards and muffling all sounds except our own footsteps and breathing. The forest felt different than it had before, older and more oppressive, the trees looming over us like silent witnesses to something we were not meant to see. Thomas navigated by compass and intuition, following Fred's directions into terrain that grew increasingly rugged. The undergrowth thinned as we descended into the hollow proper, replaced by a carpet of dead leaves and the occasional patch of ferns that had somehow survived the early autumn frosts. The creek appeared to our left, its waters running black and silent between moss-covered stones. We found the stone circle first. It was exactly as Thomas had described it, a spiral of dark river rocks with spokes radiating outward like the arms of some strange geometric figure. But something had changed since his previous visit. The bones in the center were gone, replaced by a small pile of what looked like ash, and around the perimeter of the circle, arranged at regular intervals, were 5 objects that made my blood run cold. They were driver's licenses, 5 of them, each one belonging to a different person. I recognized one of the names, Patrick Sullivan, a hiker who had gone missing in the forest 3 years earlier. His body had never been found. Thomas photographed everything while I radioed the station. Daniel's response was immediate. Do not touch anything. Mark the location and continue to the cabin. I am calling in the state police. We pushed deeper into the hollow. The mist grew thicker, swirling around us in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost intelligent. I kept catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shapes that disappeared when I turned to look directly at them. Thomas felt it too. I could see it in the way he gripped his rifle, in the tight set of his jaw. The cabin appeared suddenly, materializing out of the mist like something from a nightmare. It was exactly as Fred had described it, a ruin of rotting logs and collapsed timbers, a structure that should have been reclaimed by the forest decades ago. But there were fresh footprints in the soft earth around its foundation, and a smell that I recognized from my training but had never encountered in the field. Death. The unmistakable odor of decomposing flesh. We approached cautiously, weapons drawn. The cabin had no door, just a gap in the wall where one had once hung. Thomas went first, sweeping his flashlight through the dim interior while I covered him from outside. He made a sound I will never forget, a strangled cry that was part horror, part disbelief. When I joined him inside, I understood why. There were 3 bodies, 2 men and a woman, arranged in a rough triangle on the cabin's rotting floor. They had been dead for some time, days at least, maybe longer. But that was not what made Thomas cry out. What made him cry out was their condition. They had been posed. That is the only word that fits. Someone had arranged their bodies with obvious care, positioning their limbs in unnatural configurations that reminded me of ancient religious artwork, figures frozen in attitudes of worship or supplication. Their eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the collapsed roof, their expressions frozen in what looked like rapture rather than terror. And carved into their foreheads, still fresh enough that I could see traces of blood, was a symbol, the same spiral pattern we had found in the stone circle. I do not remember leaving the cabin. I do not remember the hike back to the trailhead or the drive back to the station. My next clear memory is sitting in Daniel's office, a cup of coffee cooling in my hands while he spoke on the phone with someone from the state police. Thomas was beside me, his face pale, his hands still trembling slightly. The state police arrived within the hour, followed by forensic teams and investigators and a seemingly endless stream of official vehicles. The hollow was cordoned off, the cabin designated a crime scene. By nightfall, the ranger station had been transformed into a command center filled with people who looked at the three of us with a mixture of suspicion and professional curiosity. They identified the victims quickly. 2 were hikers from Tennessee, a married couple who had been reported missing 2 weeks earlier. The third was a local woman, a waitress from a diner in Andrews who had disappeared a month before that. None of them had any apparent connection to each other. None of them had any known enemies. And none of them had any reason to be in Blackwater Hollow. The investigation continued for months. State police interviewed hundreds of people, examined thousands of pieces of evidence, pursued every lead no matter how unlikely. They found the driver's licenses we had discovered at the stone circle, added them to the growing file of questions without answers. They found other things too, more stone circles, more piles of bones, more evidence of habitation in places where no one had any business being. But they never found the killer. They never found any explanation for the posed bodies, the carved symbols, the impossible cabin that had burned down 35 years earlier. Eventually, the case went cold. The investigators moved on to other crimes, other tragedies. The bodies were buried, the families compensated, the official files stamped and stored in some dusty archive. But for those of us who had been there, who had seen what lurked in the depths of Blackwater Hollow, the case never really closed, because we knew something the investigators did not. We knew that whatever had killed those people was not human, and we knew that it was still out there, waiting. I saw it for the first time on the night of October 15th. I had returned to my cabin after another endless day of interviews and paperwork, too exhausted to eat, too wired to sleep. I was sitting at my desk, trying to write a letter to my mother that would explain what was happening without frightening her, when I heard something outside. It was not a dramatic sound, no howl or scream or crash, just footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling my cabin. I froze, my pen suspended over the paper, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. The footsteps continued, moving around the structure with a patience that felt almost mocking. Whoever or whatever was out there was not trying to hide. It wanted me to know it was there. I reached for my weapon, checked that it was loaded, and moved to the door. My training took over, pushing fear into the background and replacing it with cold, clinical focus. I counted to 3, then threw open the door and swept my flashlight across the darkness. Nothing. The clearing was empty, the other cabins dark, the forest beyond silent and still. I stepped outside, my breath misting in the cold air, and searched the ground for footprints. I found them, but they were wrong. The prints were roughly human in shape, but far too large, easily 18 inches long, and too deep, as if whatever had made them weighed far more than any person should. They circled my cabin exactly as the footsteps had suggested, then veered off toward the tree line and disappeared. I followed them to the edge of the forest and stopped. Something was watching me from the darkness between the trees. I could not see it clearly. It was little more than a shape, a patch of shadow that was somehow darker than the shadows around it. But I could feel its attention like a physical weight pressing down on my chest and shoulders. "Hello," I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. "This is federal land. You need to identify yourself." No response. The shape did not move, did not react in any way. It simply watched. I raised my flashlight, trying to get a better look at whatever I was facing. For a moment, the beam caught something. A face, or something like a face. too pale and too smooth, and featuring eyes that reflected the light like a cat's. Then the shape moved, sliding backward into the darkness with a fluid grace that nothing human could match, and it was gone. I stood there for a long time, flashlight trembling in my grip, waiting for it to return. It did not. Eventually, the cold drove me back inside, where I spent the rest of the night with my back to the wall and my weapon in my lap, listening for footsteps that never came. The next morning, I told Daniel what I had seen. He listened without interrupting, his face expressionless, then nodded slowly. "It has noticed you," he said. "That is not good." I asked him what it was. He shook his head. "I told you before, I do not know. But I have seen it too, years ago, and I know what it means. You are marked now. It will watch you, test you, try to figure out what kind of threat you represent. If you are lucky, it will decide you are not worth the trouble and leave you alone. If you are not lucky," he trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air. I asked him what I should do. "Stay alert," he said. "Do not go into the forest alone. And do not, under any circumstances, try to confront it. You cannot fight something like this. You can only survive it." The days that followed were among the longest of my life. I went about my duties as best I could, but every moment was shadowed by the knowledge that something was watching me, tracking my movements, studying me with an intelligence that I could not begin to comprehend. I saw it several more times, always at a distance, always at the edge of my perception. A shape in the fog, a shadow between the trees, a flicker of movement that vanished when I tried to focus on it. Sarah noticed the change in me. She cornered me one evening in the station's break room, her expression a mixture of concern and frustration. "You need to tell me what is going on," she said. "Thomas barely speaks anymore. Daniel looks like he has not slept in weeks, and you jump at every sound. If there is something happening that I do not know about, I need to know." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to protect her, to spare her the knowledge that had been eating away at my sanity. But another part of me recognized that keeping her in the dark was not protection. It was putting her at risk. So I told her. I told her about the shape I had seen outside my cabin, about the footprints, about Daniel's warning. I told her about the feeling of being watched that had not left me since that night. And I told her what I had begun to suspect, that the deaths in Blackwater Hollow were not the work of a human killer, but something far older and far more dangerous. Sarah listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You understand that everything you have just said is impossible," she finally said. "I know," I replied, "but I also know what I saw." She studied my face, searching for signs of deception or delusion. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her. "Okay," she said. "I do not believe in monsters, but I believe that you believe in what you saw, and that is enough for now. What do we do about it?" I wish I had a better answer for her. All I could do was repeat Daniel's advice. Stay alert, stay together, do not try to confront whatever was out there. It was not enough. The disappearance happened on October 22nd. A group of hikers, 3 college students from Georgia, had registered for backcountry permits 2 days earlier. They were experienced outdoors people, with proper equipment and a solid itinerary. They should have been back by noon on the 22nd. When they had not returned by sunset, their emergency contacts called the station. The 4 of us organized a search party immediately. We divided the area into sectors, each of us taking a section of the hikers' planned route. I was assigned the northern leg, a rugged stretch of trail that wound through dense forest before emerging onto a rocky ridge with views of the surrounding valleys. I found their campsite around 10 that night. The tents were still standing, arranged in a neat row beside a small stream. The fire pit was cold, the ashes scattered by wind and rain. Their packs were inside the tents, along with sleeping bags and personal effects. Everything was in order, everything was as it should be, except for the people. I searched the surrounding area for hours, my flashlight cutting through darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. I called out their names until my voice was hoarse. I followed every game trail, examined every depression in the earth that might have been a footprint. I found nothing. When dawn came, I radioed the station and reported my findings. Daniel dispatched additional searchers, including volunteers from town and a helicopter from the state police. We searched for 3 days, covering every inch of the terrain within a 10-mile radius of the campsite. We never found them. Not a trace, not a clue, not a single indication of where they had gone or what had happened to them. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist, swallowed by the forest without leaving so much as a footprint behind. The official report classified them as missing, presumed dead from exposure or misadventure. Their families held memorial services. Their friends posted tributes on social media. Life went on, as it always does, leaving tragedy behind like a stone dropped in a river. But I knew the truth. I knew that whatever lived in Blackwater Hollow had taken them, just as it had taken Patrick Sullivan and the others whose licenses we had found at the Stone Circle. I knew that somewhere in the depths of those ancient mountains, in places where no human foot had trod for centuries, their remains lay in poses that no one would ever see. And I knew that I had to do something about it. I started researching. Every spare moment I had, I spent in libraries and archives, digging through historical records and newspaper clippings and academic journals. I read everything I could find about the Appalachian Mountains, their geology and ecology and history. I studied the folklore of the Cherokee and the Shawnee and the countless other peoples who had called these mountains home. I tracked down accounts of strange disappearances, unexplained phenomena, encounters with entities that defied conventional explanation. What I found was both reassuring and terrifying. The reassuring part was that I was not alone. For as long as humans had lived in these mountains, they had told stories about things that dwelt in the deep places, creatures that predated human memory and operated according to laws that had nothing to do with the physics and biology we had learned in school. The Cherokee called them Nunahai, the immortals, the people who live anywhere, spirit beings who could appear and disappear at will and who sometimes helped humans and sometimes harmed them. The Shawnee had similar legends, as did the Iroquois and the Lenape and dozens of other tribes. Even the European settlers, who had arrived with their own beliefs and certainties, had quickly learned to respect the mountains and the forces that inhabited them. The terrifying part was that these stories suggested something far worse than a single entity haunting Blackwater Hollow. They suggested an entire ecosystem of supernatural beings, a shadow world that existed alongside our own and occasionally intersected with it in ways that were almost always catastrophic for any humans who got caught in between. I shared my findings with Daniel, who nodded grimly and told me that I was on the right track. "They have been here forever," he said. "Longer than the mountains themselves, some say. Most of the time, they keep to themselves, but every few decades, something stirs them up. A drought, an earthquake, a shift in the magnetic fields, and they become active. When that happens, people disappear." I asked him how we could stop it. "You cannot stop it," he replied. "You can only wait it out and hope that whatever is attracting their attention fades before they take too many people. And you can try to keep folks out of the areas where they are most active." It was not the answer I wanted, but it was the only answer he had. The activity continued throughout November. More hikers reported strange encounters. More people went missing. The stone circles multiplied, appearing in locations where we had searched just days before. The atmosphere at the station grew tense, a constant undercurrent of fear and frustration that colored every interaction and every decision. Sarah threw herself into the investigation with characteristic intensity. She studied the stone circles, looking for patterns in their placement and construction. She analyzed the recovered driver's licenses, searching for connections between the victims. She interviewed locals, gathering stories and legends that had been passed down through generations. And slowly, painstakingly, she began to piece together a theory. "The circles are markers," she told us one night, spreading her notes across the map table. "Each one corresponds to a natural feature, a spring, a cave entrance, an unusually old tree, and they form a pattern." She traced a line across the map, connecting the circles she had documented. "It is a boundary. Whatever these things are, they are marking their territory." I asked her what was inside the boundary. She pointed to a spot on the map, a deep hollow at the heart of the drainage system that fed into Blackwater Creek. "Here," she said. "This is the center. And based on the reports we have received, I think this is where they take the people they abduct." Thomas spoke up for the first time in days. His voice was rough, strained, the voice of a man who had been pushed past his limits. "Then we need to go there," he said. "We need to find out what is happening and stop it." Daniel shook his head. "No, absolutely not. Going into that hollow would be suicide. We cannot just let people keep disappearing, Thomas insisted. We have a responsibility to protect them. Our responsibility is to keep people out of dangerous areas, Daniel countered, not to charge into them ourselves. The argument continued for hours, growing more heated as the night wore on. In the end, we reached a compromise of sorts. Daniel would contact his superiors, push for additional resources and support. Sarah would continue her research, trying to find any historical precedent for what we were facing. Thomas and I would focus on our regular duties, maintaining a presence in the forest and monitoring for any changes in the activity. But even as we agreed to this plan, I could see that Thomas was not satisfied. There was a darkness in his eyes, a determination that went beyond professional obligation. He had taken the disappearances personally, as if each one was a failure that he alone was responsible for. And that kind of thinking, I knew from experience, could lead a man to do dangerous things. I should have kept a closer eye on him. I should have recognized the signs and intervened before it was too late. But I was exhausted and frightened and dealing with my own demons, and by the time I realized what was happening, it was already over. Thomas went into the hollow on the night of November 28th. He left a note on his desk, addressed to all of us. It explained his reasoning, that he could not in good conscience continue to stand by while innocent people vanished, that he had to see for himself what was at the heart of the territory Sarah had identified, that he hoped we would understand even if we could not approve. The note was calm and measured, the words of a man who had made peace with whatever he was about to face. We found it the next morning. Daniel's reaction was immediate and furious. He blamed himself for not seeing it coming, for not doing more to address Thomas's deteriorating mental state. He mobilized every resource at his disposal, calling in search teams from adjacent forests and requesting helicopter support from the state police. But even as he organized the response, I could see in his eyes that he did not expect to find Thomas alive. I joined the search parties that combed the forest for any sign of our missing colleague. We followed his trail as far as we could. He had not been subtle about his route, leaving clear signs of his passage through the underbrush, until it vanished at the edge of the boundary Sarah had identified. Beyond that point, there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no indication that any human being had ever entered that space. On the third day, we found his rifle. It was lying in a small clearing about a quarter mile inside the boundary, the first evidence we had found since crossing that invisible line. The weapon was undamaged, fully loaded, as if Thomas had set it down deliberately, rather than lost it in a struggle. Beside it was his ranger badge, positioned with obvious care, the metal still gleaming despite the rain that had fallen the night before. There was no blood, no sign of violence, no indication of what had happened to the man who had carried these items. It was as if he had simply walked to this spot, laid down his things, and continued on without them. Sarah examined the clearing with her usual thoroughness, documenting everything, looking for clues that might explain what we were seeing. But even she had to admit that the evidence made no sense. People did not just abandon their weapons and badges. People did not just vanish without a trace. Unless, of course, they were taken by something that operated outside the rules of ordinary reality. We searched for 3 more days before Daniel called it off. The official report would list Thomas Caldwell as missing, presumed dead. His wife and daughter would receive his pension and benefits. His name would be added to the list of rangers who had given their lives in service to the nation's forests. But I knew the truth. Thomas had not died in any conventional sense. He had been taken, absorbed into whatever lurked at the heart of that forbidden territory. And somewhere in the darkness beneath those ancient mountains, he might still exist in some form that we could not comprehend. Sarah left the Ranger service a month later. She said it was for personal reasons, but I knew the truth. She had seen too much, learned too much. The scientific worldview she had relied on her entire life had been shattered by what we had experienced, and she needed to get away. To find some way to rebuild her understanding of reality from the ground up. We kept in touch for a while. She sent me letters from various locations around the country: Colorado, California, Alaska, places with wide open spaces where she could think and heal. Eventually the letters stopped coming. I hope she found the peace she was looking for. I hope she managed to make sense of what we had been through. I stayed at the station through the winter. Daniel and I worked alone, maintaining a minimal presence in the forest while the bureaucracy ground slowly forward. Requests for additional staff went unanswered. Budget constraints prevented the hiring of replacements. We did what we could with what we had. The activity in the hollow gradually subsided. The stone circles stopped appearing. The reports of strange encounters dropped off. Whatever had been awakened seemed to be settling back into dormancy, returning to the deep places where it belonged. But I never forgot. I never stopped watching, never stopped waiting for it to return. The breaking point came on a February night, cold and clear, the stars blazing overhead like scattered diamonds. I was on patrol near the edge of the boundary when I heard something that made me stop in my tracks. It was singing. A low, rhythmic chant that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A sound that was almost musical but not quite, as if whoever was making it did not quite understand how human voices worked. The melody was strange, unsettling, built on intervals that did not exist in any music I had ever heard. I should have turned back. I should have radioed Daniel and waited for backup. But something about that song drew me forward, pulled me toward its source with a force I could not resist. I crossed the boundary. The forest changed immediately. The air grew warmer, heavy with moisture and strange smells. The trees seemed larger, older, their branches twisted into shapes that suggested intention rather than random growth. The underbrush was thick and tangled, making every step a struggle. But the singing continued, leading me deeper and deeper into the hollow. I do not know how long I walked. Time seemed to lose meaning in that place, stretching and compressing in ways that left me disoriented and confused. I might have wandered for minutes or hours or days. All I know is that eventually I emerged into a clearing unlike anything I had ever seen. It was a perfect circle, perhaps 100 feet across, ringed by standing stones that towered over my head. The stones were covered in carvings, spirals, and faces and symbols that hurt my eyes to look at, and they seemed to glow with a faint, pulsing light that had no apparent source. In the center of the clearing stood a figure. It was tall, perhaps 7 feet, with proportions that were almost but not quite human. Its skin was pale as moonlight, its features smooth and ageless, its eyes dark pits that reflected no light. It wore no clothing, but its body was covered in patterns that matched the carvings on the stones, spirals and faces and symbols that seemed to writhe and shift as I watched. The singing was coming from it. Its mouth was moving, producing that strange, impossible melody, and as I watched, I realized that the sound was not just music, it was language. It was speaking, communicating something that my human mind could not quite grasp. I raised my rifle. I do not know why. I knew, on some level, that a bullet would be useless against whatever I was facing, but the weapon was the only thing I had, the only connection to the rational world I had left behind. The figure stopped singing. Its eyes fixed on me, and I felt its attention like a physical weight, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. Then it spoke, not in that strange chanting language, but in English, in a voice that sounded like wind through dead leaves. "Arthur Jenkins," it said. "You should not be here." I tried to respond, but my voice would not work. My body was frozen, held in place by a force I could not fight. The figure took a step toward me, then another, then another. With each step, the pressure on my chest increased, until I was certain my ribs would crack from the strain. "You have seen too much," it continued. "Learned too much. You are becoming a problem." I managed to force out a single word. "What?" The figure tilted its head, a gesture that might have been curiosity or might have been amusement. "What am I?" it asked. "What are we?" Those questions have no answers that you would understand. We are what we have always been. We are the ones who were here before your kind crawled out of the mud. We are the ones who will be here long after you have turned to dust. We are the mountains. We are the forest. We are the darkness between the stars. It was close now, close enough that I could see the details of its face. The too smooth skin, the absence of pores or blemishes, the eyes that seemed to contain entire galaxies of darkness. It reached out and touched my forehead with one long, pale finger. Pain. Incredible, overwhelming pain, as if every nerve in my body was on fire at once. And with the pain came visions. Memories that were not my own. Images of the mountain as it had been before humans arrived. Vast and empty and alive with things that no human eye had ever seen. Images of the first people to enter this territory, the hunters and gatherers who had learned to respect what lived here and to leave offerings at the boundary stones. Images of the Europeans who had come later, who had not respected anything, who had cut down the forests and dammed the rivers and driven the old inhabitants deeper and deeper into their hidden places. And images of what those old inhabitants had done in response. The disappearances that had plagued these mountains for centuries. The bodies that had been found in impossible conditions. The people who had wandered into the wrong places at the wrong times and had never been seen again. "You are fortunate," the figure said, withdrawing its finger. "My kin wish to take you, to add you to their collection. But I have argued on your behalf. You are a watcher, a recorder. Your kind needs people like you, people who remember the old stories and pass them on." I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, my mind reeling from what I had seen. "Go," the figure continued. "Leave this place and do not return. Tell your stories to those who will listen. But remember this, we are patient. We have watched your kind rise and spread, and believe yourselves masters of the world, and we will watch you fall, as all things fall, in the fullness of time." The singing started again, and the world around me seemed to dissolve, the clearing and the stones and the figure all fading into a blur of light and shadow. When my vision cleared, I was lying at the edge of the boundary, my rifle beside me, the forest quiet and still around me. I do not remember the walk back to the station. I do not remember radioing Daniel or collapsing into my bunk or sleeping for 14 hours straight. My next clear memory is Daniel sitting beside my bed, his face grave, asking me what had happened. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing more troubled with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "You are the first person I have ever heard of who went into that place and came back," he finally said. "Whatever happened in there, whatever that thing told you, you need to take it seriously." I asked him what I should do. "That is your choice," he replied. "But if I were you, I would leave, get as far away from these mountains as possible, and never come back." I took his advice. 2 weeks later, I submitted my resignation and moved to Ohio, where I had family and where the landscape was flat and open and free of ancient, hungry things. I got a job as a county surveyor, married a woman I met at church, raised 2 children who knew nothing of what their father had experienced. I built a normal life, a safe life, a life that had no room for monsters or mysteries, but I never forgot, and I never stopped watching. Over the years, I have collected reports from the Appalachians, disappearances, strange encounters, unexplained phenomena. The numbers are staggering. Hundreds of people vanish in those mountains every decade, far more than can be explained by accidents or wildlife attacks or simple disorientation. Most are eventually found or presumed dead from natural causes, but some, a significant minority, simply disappear without a trace. I have reached out to other rangers, other witnesses, other survivors. Their stories echo my own, glimpses of impossible creatures, encounters with entities that should not exist, narrow escapes from fates that defy comprehension. We are a scattered community, bound together by experiences that no one else would believe, supporting each other as best we can across the distances that separate us. Daniel Wright died in 1995, alone in his cabin at the Nantahala station. The official cause of death was a heart attack, but the ranger who found him said he looked peaceful, almost relieved, as if he had finally been released from a burden he had carried for too long. I attended his funeral and spoke to his widow, who told me that he had been expecting it, that he had made his peace with whatever was coming. Sarah Morrison contacted me once in 2003, sending a postcard from somewhere in New Mexico. She said she had found answers of a sort. She said she had learned to live with what we had experienced and even to find meaning in it. She said she hoped I had done the same. I tried to write back, but the return address she had given turned out to be a vacant lot. I never heard from her again. Thomas Caldwell was declared legally dead in 1994, 7 years after his disappearance. His wife remarried eventually, and his daughter grew up and had children of her own. I have watched them from a distance over the years, never making contact, never revealing what I know about what really happened to their husband and father. Some secrets are too heavy to share, and the hollow, the place at the heart of that forbidden territory, remains untouched to this day. The boundaries have shifted over the decades, expanding and contracting according to patterns that no one understands. But the center remains constant, a dark heart that beats with a rhythm older than human memory. I am 71 years old now. My wife passed away 3 years ago, and my children have lives of their own, busy with careers and families and all the ordinary concerns that fill an ordinary existence. I spend my days reading, mostly, and tending a small garden behind my house. I go to church on Sundays and volunteer at the local library on Wednesdays. I live a quiet life, a peaceful life, the life of a man who has earned his rest. But at night, I still dream of those mountains. I dream of standing stones and spiral symbols, of chanting voices and pale, ageless figures. I dream of Thomas Caldwell walking into the darkness, his rifle and badge left behind like offerings. I dream of Sarah Morrison searching for answers in places where no answers exist. I dream of Daniel Wright, watching and waiting and knowing things that he could never share. And sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, I dream of the clearing. I am standing in the center, surrounded by those ancient stones, and the figure is there before me. It looks exactly as it did 40 years ago, pale and smooth and terrible, and its dark eyes hold me with the same weight, the same impossible attention. You remembered, it says. You told the stories. I try to respond, but as always, my voice will not work. That is good, it continues. Your kind forgets so easily. You build your cities and your machines, and you believe that you have conquered the world. But we remember. We have always remembered. It reaches out with that long, pale finger, touching my forehead just as it did in that February night so long ago. And when you are gone, it whispers. When your kind has turned to dust and blown away on the wind, we will still be here. Watching, waiting, remembering. I wake up covered in sweat, my heart pounding, the echo of that voice still ringing in my ears. And I lie there in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, knowing that what I experienced was not just a dream. They are real. They have always been real. And they are waiting for us to forget. I am telling you this now because I do not have much time left. The doctors say it is my heart, weakened by age and stress and a lifetime of carrying secrets that were never meant to be carried. They give me months, maybe a year if I am lucky. I have made my peace with that. I have lived a good life, a full life, and I am not afraid of what comes next. But before I go, I want to make sure that someone knows the truth. I want to make sure that the stories survive, even if I do not. So if you are reading this, if you are listening to these words, I ask you to remember. Remember that the world is stranger than we know. That there are things in the wild places that do not follow our rules or respect our boundaries. Remember that the Appalachian Mountains have stood for hundreds of millions of years and will stand for hundreds of millions more, long after our cities have crumbled and our civilization has been forgotten. And if you ever find yourself in those ancient woods, if you ever feel the pull of that vast and mysterious wilderness, be careful. Stay on the marked trails. Do not wander into places where you do not belong. And if you see something that should not be there, a figure in the fog, a face between the trees, a shape that moves in ways that nothing human can, do not approach it. Do not try to investigate. Just turn around and walk away as fast as you can, and do not look back. Because some things in those woods are best left undisturbed. Some secrets are better kept, and some hunts, as I learned so many years ago, are not what they seem. My name is Arthur Jenkins. I was a ranger in the Appalachian National Forests. And this is my testimony. Remember it, share it, and whatever you do, do not forget. The forest remembers. The forest always remembers. And one day, when we least expect it, the forest will come calling. Do not answer. I have said what I needed to say. The rest is up to you. Good luck, and God help us all. The pages of my journal are almost full now. I have written everything I can remember, everything I can bear to put into words. There are details I have left out, moments too personal, too painful, too strange to share even in this confession. But the essence is here. The truth, or as much of it as I can capture, is preserved. Tomorrow I will mail this manuscript to a publisher I found online, someone who specializes in accounts like mine. I do not know if they will believe me. I do not know if anyone will believe me, but that is not the point. The point is that the story will exist, that it will be out there in the world, available to anyone who needs to hear it. And maybe, just maybe, it will save someone. Maybe some hiker will read these words and decide not to venture off the marked trail. Maybe some hunter will remember my warnings and turn back when the forest grows too quiet. Maybe some ranger, young and idealistic and full of confidence, will understand that there are limits to what human beings can face and will know when to call for help. If even one person is saved by what I have written, then all of this, the fear, the loss, the decades of silence, will have been worth it. I am sitting on my porch as I write these final words, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. It is beautiful here in Ohio, in its own quiet way. Not as dramatic as the mountains, not as wild or mysterious, but there is peace here, a sense of safety that I never felt in those ancient woods. The trees are starting to turn, the first hints of autumn color appearing on the maples and oaks that line my street. In a few weeks, the leaves will be blazing with color. a final burst of glory before the long sleep of winter. I have always loved this time of year. It reminds me that endings can be beautiful, that there is grace even in letting go. My hands are trembling as I write. It is harder to hold the pen now, harder to form the letters that have always come so easily. But I will finish. I will see this through to the end. One more thing before I close. I have never told anyone this, not even Daniel, not even Sarah. But in the years since that night in the clearing, I have sometimes felt a presence watching me, not threatening, not malevolent, just watching, as if something from those mountains followed me here, keeping track of me across all these miles and all these years. I do not know what to make of it. Maybe it is my imagination, a product of the trauma I experienced. Maybe it is something real, a connection that was forged in that moment of contact and can never be broken. Or maybe it is simply a reminder that the world is larger and stranger than we will ever understand, and that our place in it is smaller and more precarious than we like to believe. Whatever it is, I have made my peace with it. I have carried this weight for 40 years, and I am ready to set it down. The sun is almost gone now, just a sliver of light on the horizon. The streetlights are flickering on, casting pools of yellow light that push back against the gathering darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a dog is barking. Somewhere closer, a neighbor is calling her children in for dinner. Ordinary sounds, ordinary life. The world going on as it always has, oblivious to the things that lurk just beyond its edge. I am grateful for this life. I am grateful for the years of peace, the family I raised, the small joys that have sustained me through the long nights. I am grateful that I got to grow old, that I was given the time to make sense of what happened and to find a way to live with it. Not everyone is so fortunate. The darkness is complete now. Stars are beginning to appear, faint pinpricks of light in the vast dome of the sky. I should go inside, should eat something, should try to get some rest. But I find myself reluctant to move, reluctant to let go of this moment. Because somewhere out there, beyond the lights of the city, beyond the highways and the suburbs and all the comfortable trappings of civilization, the mountains are still standing, the forests are still growing, and the things that live in the deep places are still watching, still waiting, still remembering. They have been patient for millions of years. They can afford to be patient a little longer, and when the time is right, when our grip on this world finally loosens and our bright lights finally fade, they will be there to reclaim what was always theirs. This is not a warning, it is simply a fact. The universe does not care about our fears or our hopes or our desperate need to believe that we are special. It simply is, vast and ancient and utterly indifferent to the small creatures that crawl across its surface. We are not the masters of this world. We never were. And sooner or later, we will have to reckon with that truth. But not tonight. Tonight, I will go inside and make myself a cup of tea. I will sit in my favorite chair and listen to the radio and pretend, for a little while longer, that everything is normal. I will let the warmth of my home wrap around me like a blanket, keeping the darkness at bay. And tomorrow, I will mail this manuscript and hope that someone, somewhere, will read it and understand. That is all any of us can do, in the end. Tell our stories, share our truths, and hope that they matter.